I got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I got love, peace, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got joy and pain and joy inside my DNA.
Hello guys, welcome back to my channel The Fanfic Fantasy. Join us as we explore the world of fanfiction and fantasy and bring you the best story and discussions. This is the first part of What If Tanjiro Time Traveled and Became a Demon? So give this video a like and subscribe for more videos in future. So let's get into the fanfic. Note, I use the term waxing moon and waning moon instead of upper moon and lower moon because I find the official translation to be, well, unimaginative. I saw a translation with someone calling them waxing and waning moons, which I find to be far more interesting and clever, so those are the terms I use in the story. The unusual sound woke Nezuko far earlier than she would have liked. She could tell from the noises in the other room that her mother had just gotten up to begin the day's chores and would have, very kindly, let her sleep a little longer, but a soft whimpering drew her out of her own rest. Was Rokuta having a bad dream? She managed to pry her eyes open and looked over at her little brother, sleeping soundly on his own futon. She took a moment to smile at the adorable picture he made. Her other younger siblings didn't seem distressed either. They hadn't even woken with the soft noises as she had. So she turned to the last of her siblings and her eyes widened. She'd never seen him look so pained. T-tanjiro, she whispered, moving carefully through the mass of sleeping Komodo children to his side. She hoped she could help him without waking anyone else. Just as she reached him, he tensed up, as if the pain had increased, gritting his teeth, veins bulging in his neck and around his temples. Worriedly, she put a calming hand on his forehead, checking for a fever. He did feel a little warm. No sooner had she thought this than his eyes snapped open and he sat bolt upright, putting a hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. His sudden movement had her jumping back, startled. She could have sworn that she'd seen kanji written in his eyes. What? For a moment, neither one of them moved, but then Tanjiro looked around. Instead of calming him down, as she thought the motion should, he seemed to tense even further and he lurched to his feet. "Oh Onii," she started, but then remembered her sleeping siblings. Looking back at them, she bit her lip. She didn't want to shout and wake them up, but she also wanted to make sure her older brother was all right. As if in response to her thoughts, Tanjiro bolted for the door, steps crunching softly over the tatami mats as he slid it open, stumbling into the other room. Nezuko's worry spiked and she hurried as quietly as she could after him in time to see him practically shove the front door to their home out of the way and stumble into the snow outside. In his sleeping clothes, T-tanjiro, their mother asked from the other side of the room where she'd been building the fire to prepare their breakfast. He didn't respond, not even closing the door behind him. Their mother looked over to Nezuko, who met her worried gaze. "He had a bad dream," she said softly. A little of the confusion cleared from the older woman's eyes, but she still looked worriedly after him. "I'll go get him." Nezuko volunteered and went to step out, only to realize her feet were bare. His feet had been bare. Her worry grew. "Take your Fukagatsu and his as well, please," she said, hurrying over to help Nezuko get ready faster. "And his Hanton. I'll have breakfast ready for you when you come back." "Hi," Nezuko agreed, as she finished putting the footwear and her heavy Hanton coat over her current clothes. She didn't have time to change into something heavier. It still took her all too long to get ready, and by the time she did, she could hear the others beginning to stir behind her. She pushed aside any guilt she had for waking them. She had to get to her older brother. The cold bit at her more than usual when she stepped outside, but she ignored it, instead taking off at the best run she could in the new snow. She didn't find it difficult to follow his trail, and it only took her a couple of minutes to reach the riverside. He'd stumbled to his knees in the snow on the small dock that they'd built into the river to more easily get at the deeper waters and fish. He just stared at the water below him as if it held all the answers in the universe. "Onii-chan," she called out to him. He didn't respond, so she decided to use his name. "Tanjiro Onii-chan," she yelled, screamed. She hadn't used that name in years, but she desperately hoped it would get through to him. He startled and turned to look at her, eyes wide. "And Nezuko?" he asked, almost as if he didn't believe he was seeing her. Then a sort of desperation took him over and he stood, rushing towards her. "Nezuko, don't step in the snow, baka," she said, not caring how rude she sounded. He'd really scared her, was still scaring her, to be honest. He looked down and around them, blinking as if seeing the snow for the first time, and then lifted his feet to look at them. Nezuko gasped at how red they were. He just seemed surprised when he looked back up at her, confusion in his eyes. It's cold." Nezuko's breath caught in her throat. He hadn't even noticed that. "Put these on," she said shortly, holding out the winter clothing. He seemed to blink at them as if not really seeing them either. "All right," he muttered, taking the straw-woven boots out of her hand, sitting down right there on the dock. Nezuko bit her lip, trying not to worry too much. She had to get him home. But what had driven him out here in the first place? Onii-chan, she said softly, holding out his hand as he stood once again. Somehow, she got the feeling any damage the cold would do had mostly already been done and he needed to get warm again. But she put her hands on his cold cheeks, turning his head to face hers. His eyes looked completely normal. The brown that always seemed more red than anything, the color that reminded her of their father, stared right back. She felt her shoulders relax a little at that. "What happened?" she asked softly. His breath hitched and his gaze shifted back to the water before settling on her again. "And my eyes," he said. "What do they look like?" Any relief she'd gained fled and she stiffened. Then she told him the truth. "They look normal, Onii-chan," she said as calmly as she could. He closed his eyes and slumped in his back relief, head coming to rest on her shoulder. And she felt horrible for taking that away from him, but it was so abnormal, she felt she had to tell him. But when you woke up," he stiffened and his breath hitched, but she continued. "I swear I saw kanji in your eyes." The breath he let out sounded somewhere between a cry and a whimper. He backed away from her, putting his hand up to his cheeks just below his eyes. She didn't want to add to that, but felt she had to say everything. "On your teeth." "My teeth?" he asked, voice harsh. Then he put his thumbs up to feel his canines. They looked perfectly normal, but that didn't seem to reassure him. "And my hands? They're too cold. I can't feel if they're normal now." He pointed to his mouth. She nodded her head. "They're fine." He took another steadying breath. My eyes. What did they say?" He sounded so shaky, like he didn't really want to know but had to. She bit her lip, wondering if she should say. Noticing her hesitation, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It only partially worked. "Nezuko, please." Waxing zero. His legs gave out on him and his knees hit the ground. Somehow his already pale face went even whiter, eyes wide in horror and no longer fixed on her, but staring off. "T-tanjiro," she yelped, rushing forward to catch him if he fell further. He didn't, though, just sitting there on his knees for several seconds before slowly turning down to look at his hands. "Human," he whispered to himself, sounding frailer than she'd ever heard before. He'd always been so strong. "I'm human, but..." "Nai-chan," she said softly, kneeling beside him in the snow. "What's going on?" Her heart told her he knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew something. He took a shuddering breath and she realized tears had begun to run down his cheeks. I can't do it, Nezuko. Not this time. I'm not strong enough." She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was one of the strongest people she knew and how much she looked up to him, but that would only add to his burden right now. So she just put her arms around him and held him while he cried, hating herself for feeling so useless. Nezuko had to lead an almost despondent Tanjiro back to the house. Everyone else sat around the pot above the fire in the center of the room eating their breakfast in a tense silence. Once Nezuko stepped in, and everyone saw her, they all began bombarding her with questions. She only held up a hand. Fortunately, everyone stopped, even the younger ones, probably seeing Tanjiro behind her acting so uncharacteristically depressed, staring ahead with a vacant expression. Their mother stood and approached, looking unsure as she glanced between them. Nezuko didn't blame her. "What happened?" she finally asked, specifically addressing Nezuko. She bit her lip and glanced over her shoulder. Tanjiro didn't even seem to notice they'd arrived back at home, lost in his thoughts. Or, more likely, his nightmare. Seeing him like that made Nezuko's stomach twist. I'm not sure," she responded quietly. "Onii-chan had a nightmare, a bad one, but something else happened too." His eyes and teeth changed for a minute. "I saw them myself, before going back to normal." She paused again then looked up at her mother, not bothering to hide the full force of her fear. "Mama, I think something terrible is coming." Their mother stared at them, taken aback and more than a little worried. But eventually she realized that they'd let in the cold and gestured for them to come inside. Her expression only worsened when she saw Nezuko take her brother's hand and physically pull him along. Once the door closed behind them, their mother put her hands on Tanjiro's cheeks and had him meet her eyes. It took him a moment, but to their relief he did. "Mom," he whispered softly. Then, before she could say anything else, he threw his arms around her waist with a yelp and cried into her shoulder. "Mom." "Oh, Tanjiro," she whispered softly, then glanced over at Nezuko as she rubbed circles on his shuddering back. "Please get both of you some breakfast." Nezuko nodded as she removed her own footwear and outer coat before hurrying over to the pot. "One-chan," Shidru whispered worriedly, "what's wrong with Onii-chan?" She paused as she stuck the scoop into the rice pot and took a deep breath before continuing. "He dreamed about something that scared him so badly. hurt him so much that he's like that. She glanced over her shoulder. Will he get better? Hanako asked worriedly. Better, Rokuta insisted. And what was she supposed to say to that? Because honestly, she didn't know, but she had to believe he would. Yes, she replied brightly. It might take him a long time, but he'll get better. The others looked relieved, and some of them like they were about to get up and go over to him. But she stopped them. Leave him alone for right now. He needs mama. Then she looked at the small bowls in front of her siblings and their half-finished food. You need to finish eating, she admonished, forcing a smile. And we need to make room for Onii-chan. He'll need to warm up by the fire. The others nodded and scooted around, making room while Nezuko set up Tanjiro's rice and fish before taking her own. Itadakimasu, she said softly and then began to eat as if nothing had happened. It took all of her willpower to not look over her shoulder at her crying older brother, but she didn't want the younger kids butting into what could be a very delicate situation. They continued to shoot him glances, but thankfully took their cue from her otherwise. She wasn't sure how long it had been when he finally calmed down, but she was almost done with her breakfast. Everyone else, except Rokuta, had finished as well. He concentrated hard as he tried to use chopsticks to eat without spilling. He looked so adorable Nezuko couldn't help but smile at his efforts. Takeo, she said to her other brother, smiling at him. Would you mind gathering the dishes for now? He frowned but otherwise nodded and grabbed the bucket they used for dirty dishes, gathering his siblings' bowls as well. Nezuko had just finished hers and handed it over when their mother led Tanjiro to the fire pit and sat him down in front of his breakfast. He'd already taken off his fukagatsu and gingerly stuck his red, swollen feet towards the fire, wincing a little at the heat. Hanako seemed to have reached her breaking point because as he surged forward and wrapped her arms around Tanjiro, Nezuko dove for the food bowl to make sure he didn't spill it as he caught her. Onii-chan, she yelled. Don't be scared. I'll protect you. Tanjiro froze for a moment, but then folded around Hanako, hugging her tightly, his already tear-streaked cheeks dripping with water once again. Then their younger sister sat back, her hands still on her brother's shoulders. Come play with us. That'll make you happy again. Instead of smiling at that as he normally would, he just shuddered and leaned his head forward to rest on his sister's shoulders as he had with Nezuko earlier. Hanako, confused, just patted his hair and looked around at her siblings. No one seemed to know what to do, except Shidru. He stood up and, determined, walked over and put his hands around his siblings. Takeo decided he wanted in on the hug as did Rokuta, both practically throwing themselves at their siblings. Nezuko smiled and decided to add her own love to the pile of children as she put her arms around Takeo and Shidru behind Tanjiro's back. After a couple of moments, their mother cleared her throat. She looked so softly upon them and Nezuko could see she did not want to break them up. But she had also always been a practical woman who knew when something needed to be addressed. She wouldn't let this go. All right, everyone, go get dressed and begin your chores for the day. A series of protests and groans answered her, but everyone got up and stalked back towards the sleeping room. Come on, Onii-chan, Hanako said, tugging at Tanjiro's arms. Except for Tanjiro. I need to speak with him, their mother corrected. Hanako wasn't the only one concerned and displeased with that. However, their mother silenced them with a raise of her hand. Reluctantly, the other siblings stalked away, some of them rather angrily. Nezuko shook her head fondly and went to stand. You too, Nezuko, their mother said softly, then glanced at Tanjiro. If you're okay with that. He nodded, reaching over and grabbing Nezuko's hand, much to her surprise. She squeezed it, but then extracted her fingers. For a moment he looked lost, almost betrayed, at her, but then she held out his now cool breakfast. He blinked. Oh, right, I can eat rice again. She frowned, tipping her head to one side, about to ask what that meant. But her mother shook her head as Tanjiro took the bowl, and began to pick at it, putting small amounts on his tongue and chewing them slowly. He seemed to wince every time his teeth closed on the food. But Nezuko couldn't really figure out why. She was sure it had something to do with his statement. But if he couldn't eat rice in his dream, what could he eat? She remembered the sharp canines she'd seen and decided that perhaps she didn't want to know. Tanjiro, their mother said, I want you to tell me about your dream. He froze, one scoop of rice halfway to his mouth as his eyes found hers. He swallowed and slowly lowered the chopsticks back to the still full bowl. I know it's difficult, but you need to talk this out. Nezuko wasn't sure it was such a good idea to talk about it here, where their siblings were undoubtedly listening in. But her mother wasn't entirely wrong either. This, whatever it was, had affected him too deeply. Finally, after several seconds of quiet, he opened his mouth. I dreamed that I kept waking up today, this morning, again and again and again. But every night, a monster comes and kills everyone. Yu, Okuda, Takeo, Shidru, Hinako, everyone, except Nezuko. He turns her into a monster like him, a monster that can only eat humans. He faded off, seeming to choke on his words. Nezuko reached over in concern and rubbed his back. He glanced over at her, gratefully before forcing his words out. I was out selling charcoal, like I was supposed to today, and didn't get back until late and stayed at Sabero-san's house. That's why I survived. I tried to learn to fight these monsters, and managed to stop Nezuko from attacking anyone until she could resist herself. Nezuko put a hand to her mouth, very much not liking the sound of this dream. No wonder her brother had such a reaction. I kept looking for a way to turn her human again and fight the person. He practically spit the word as if it were an insult. Nezuko wasn't sure she liked seeing her normally carefree older brother spit such vitriol, but didn't say anything as he continued. In the end, we almost had him, but I was too close. He did the same thing to me as he did to her as a last-ditch effort, turned me into a monster that attacked people, and I ran off. These monsters have powers called blood arts. When I activated mine, I woke up here, human again. And every time I died after that, I do the same thing again and again and again. He took another steadying breath and then let it out slowly. Naturally, I tried to save you all, took you all to the village. But he found us there that night, destroyed the entire village. When I woke again, I tried to tell you everything, but he faded off again, looking away as his hands tightened at his sides. You didn't believe me. I don't want to say what happened that time, but I died and woke up again. I went out to find that monster myself, and he killed me. I tried making you all run to other towns, hide in the woods, hide at old man Sabero's. Nothing ever worked. He practically despaired, head dropping into his hands at those words. He didn't cry again, but Nezuko could tell he was close. She scooted up to his side and laid her head on his shoulder, letting him know she was there. After a moment he looked back up at their mother again, who didn't seem to know what to make of this dream. Nezuko could relate. The only thing that works to save everyone is to send you all away, and wait here myself. When he comes by, if I can distract him long enough, he turns me into a monster. That's what I've been doing every time after that. But the last time, he swallowed, looking more than a little green. I don't know why he took a special interest in me, but he did. Set out to capture me, and instead of ignoring me like he usually does, he began shaking. Was it a good idea to go on? She wasn't sure, but their mother didn't stop him. He licked his lips and took another breath. I tried to resist. I tried so hard. But he made me eat people. Nezuko gasped and their mother looked utterly stricken. I didn't want to. I swear I didn't want to. But he wouldn't let me sleep. That's how I usually store up energy as a monster, and he wouldn't let me. He forced me to join his army and fight his other generals. He told me I could be the strongest, and if I didn't help him, he'd hunt all of you down and kill you all. He took another shuddering breath, but it didn't seem to help this time. Tears came to his eyes again. I tried so hard to keep you all safe, but I couldn't let him do whatever he wanted. But he was so strong, and they couldn't stop him even with my help. He left to kill you all, and I tried to save you. I tried so hard to get there first, even as tired as I was. But when I got there, he made me to save everyone. Just because he could. He said I was his new favorite. No one else should have that monster's attention. He faded off, letting out deep, heaving sobs again. He always finds a way to win. Why? He roared out suddenly, slamming his fist against the floor in his anger. On the 1 time I get him. So many people plead died. On what made me do. He shuddered, drawing in and putting his arms around himself. How had a dream changed her once cheerful brother so much? That scared Nezuko almost as much as his dream did. What a horrible dream, she whispered, although she herself wasn't entirely sure it was a dream. But then what else could it be? Could her brother really wake up on the same morning multiple times? Monsters and magic, and this just seemed more like one of the mythological tales her grandmother used to tell instead of real life. Have you tried the river? Their mother said softly. Nezuko looked over at her, troubled and puzzled. Apparently she wasn't the only one, because Tanjiro managed to pause and look up at her too. Our river. We have a boat. It's small, but I'm sure we could all fit in it. We could even take some of our belongings in the water buckets and barrels. We'd have to tighten them down, though. She faded off, looking thoughtful. Her children continued to blink at her for several seconds. Then Tanjiro's face lit up with a tentative hope. It was the most positive she'd seen him that morning. Mom, why you believe me? He asked softly. She came out of her reverie at his words and glanced sadly at him before moving over to put her arms around him. Nezuko sat back to give her some room, simply watching them. Oh, my son. My wonderful, incredible son. I will admit I didn't believe it was anything more than a dream at first. But then, well, two reasons convinced me. First, she glanced over at Nezuko. You said you saw his eyes change yourself. Nezuko nodded, realizing that was why her mother had wanted her to stay. Yes, I saw kanji written in his eyes and his teeth were sharp. Later, he looked completely normal, which made absolutely no sense. But then she didn't know particulars about human-eating monsters either. Their mother nodded in confirmation as she went back to rubbing her son's back. And the second reason I believe you. This can't be the result of a dream. This reaction, it's too much. It reminds me of my father when he came back from the Russian war. She shook her head, shuddering a bit herself. Then she looked down at the quivering ball of teenager in her arms. You've been through so much, and I am so sorry I didn't believe you before. Can you ever forgive me? He didn't respond, simply holding on to her and crying. He'd been doing that a lot, even for Tanjiro. He'd always seemed so strong, but she'd seen him cry plenty of times. Just, not like this. But you didn't answer my question, their mother finally went on, her voice calm and probing. Did you try the river? Traveling by water can be much faster than by foot. We could make it to the town with enough time to buy a cart and be well on our way when night falls. We could even leave a false trail into the woods and see if he follows those so we don't have to worry about him attacking the village. Tanjiro sat back and stared at his mother, eyes red and puffy, mouth hanging open, as if she'd just hung the stars in the sky. That's a great idea, Mom. I mean, the false trails might not work, but I know he doesn't have as good of a sense of smell as I have, and I'd likely lose a trail in the city, even if I could follow it over water. And I know exactly where to go. And he beamed, still not back to normal, but that was definitely far closer to the Tanjiro she knew. Something inside her she didn't know had clenched up relaxed. Well, their mother said with a smile. Then I suppose we should pack up, shouldn't we? Why yes, Tanjiro practically yelled, grinning, then shot to his feet. Oni-chan. Nezuko stopped him. He paused, blinking down at her. She held up his half-eaten bowl of rice. You can't just sleep and gain energy anymore. You have to eat like a normal human. Because he seemed like he really needed the grounding right now. He needed to know he was still human and he needed to get back into the habit of taking care of himself. He blinked at her, as if unable to comprehend her words, but then he snorted and sat back down, grabbing the bowl, although not before sending her an enormous Tanjiro smile. That, more than anything, helped to ease her worries. Every now and then, Tanjiro would give a smile that was all his, even if she couldn't begin to explain why. Right, he said, and then began shoving the rice and fish into his mouth, barely chewing before swallowing. She sighed, half tempted to smack him over the head and get him to slow down. But there was a tenseness there that hadn't been there before. He still didn't like eating, and now she had an inkling as to why. But it was better than it had been, so she'd count it as a win for now. 2 weeks later, Urokudaki Sakonji didn't quite know what to expect when he sensed someone approaching his mountain. But an entire family of children who wanted to become demon slayers wasn't remotely close. What do you mean? You already know the water form? Urokudaki asked, more than a little shocked when the redhead just smiled at him knowingly. Well, it's been a while, so I don't have the muscle memory, but... He took a training sword and proceeded to show him every single water-breathing form. What? He even breathed correctly, although he fell down at the end, clutching at his chest. Forgot how much that hurt. Urokudaki could only stare. Who showed you how to do that? At which point the boy looked up and smiled. You did, Urokudaki-sensei. What? I've been waking up in the past over and over again, but you taught it to me the first time. And then he just smiled a beaming smile that practically sang of sunshine, which made no sense. Sunshine didn't sing, smiles didn't shine light, and yet, this boy smelled completely sincere too. So, you just need conditioning. He nodded. Yup. Urokudaki put a hand up to his forehead, wishing he could knead his temple through his mask. 2 brats being trained on the mountain, setting up the traps. He'd never get any sleep. And he had 3 other children to train too. And a mother, apparently. He withheld a groan before looking back at his small house. They'd have to expand that too. With what time, he didn't know. Although, every other day, you will climb the mountain. Your sister will climb the days you don't. Your mother, once she gets settled, will get set into the schedule as well. She'd wanted to clean his house and set her children up and make sure everyone had their own chores to do before she could really get into her own training. Urokudaki wasn't about to argue. The days you aren't training are the days you will help build an extension onto the house. Understood. The boy's eyes practically glittered as he nodded. Hi, Urokudaki-sensei. Good. Stretch and then give me 1,000 swings of your sword while I go and draw up some plans. He was sure he had paper somewhere, and some charcoal he could use for drawing. Tanjiro immediately began to do as he'd been told. He had a good base, not extremely solid, but that would likely come with time, because he'd learned all of this before, right? His mother had confirmed it, even though she looked about as he felt. Sakonji wasn't entirely sure he understood, even now, but decided that he really shouldn't think of it until he could write to Yubayashiki-sama. As he walked towards the house, he saw the three middle children playing tag, laughing and giggling. It wasn't a sound he'd thought he'd ever hear in his home again. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Later that night, when half the kids woke up crying from nightmares, he reconsidered. Sakonji stared at the words written on the paper in front of him, almost as soon as the Kamado family and himself had come to a consensus, and Tanjiro had explained his unique circumstances. He'd written to Yubayashiki-sama explaining everything. The head of the Demon Slayer Corps had responded with some questions of his own, and, like Sakonji, he'd been skeptical of such claims. He asked if the boy could prove what he said. When Sakonji had taken this to Tanjiro, he'd replied that he could talk about the pillars, although it would be who would be pillars in 2 years' time and his list may not be current. Sakonji had sent the reply and waited. The crow came back sooner than any reply to a missive he'd sent before, coming with agreement to the terms and asking for as much detail as possible. Tanjiro agreed with his usual smile and he sat down with Sakonji, who agreed to write it for the boy, strictly as a witness. Over the next 2 hours, Tanjiro spoke of each of the pillars he remembered in great detail, starting with Sakonji's own student and replacement as the water pillar, Tomioka Jiyu. Tanjiro began with an extremely accurate description of Jiyu's physical appearance, right down to the half and half haori he tended to wear. Then Tanjiro went on to describe his personality, from his normally cold exterior to his matter-of-fact approach to his absolute frustration with people who begged and didn't fight for what they wanted. Then he spoke of Jiyu's past, and while he didn't know everything, he did bring up the names Sabito and Makomo, which had given Sakonji an extremely long pause. He made a note that everything the boy had said was true and that he'd gotten absolutely none of it from Sakonji himself. It was an eye-opening experience. Then the boy went on to describe Shinobu, the insect pillar. Apparently, he described her height, the way she tended to do her hair, her insect-like haori that made her look like a butterfly when she fought. He knew she'd lost her sister, the former flower pillar named Kani, but didn't know how outside of the fact that she'd been killed by Waxing Moon too. Once he finished with her, he went on to describe the wind pillar, a Morechi who Tanjiro admitted he didn't tend to get along with. He still spoke highly of the man's skills afterwards, and then went on to describe his relationship with his little brother, who apparently couldn't use breath styles but fought with demon abilities after devouring them. To say Sakonji had been horrified would be similar to calling the sun warm, and he let Yubayashiki know that too. Seriously, what was anyone involved in that situation thinking? That could only end badly. After that, Tanjiro spoke of the stone pillar, who was blind and very devoted to his beliefs. Then he spoke of the love pillar and then the snake pillar, who he admitted he didn't know as well but had run into in a few lifetimes. He described Yuzui the sound pillar and his 3 wives, then spoke of the mist pillar, and ended with the flame pillar, one Rengoku Kyojiro. From his description, it seemed the new flame pillar had become even more outspoken than his father, the previous flame pillar. Once Tanjiro spoke of how said former flame pillar treated his family, Sakonji made a mental note to go over there and give the man a piece of his mind, grieving for his wife or not. There was no reason to treat his children like that. He couldn't force the man to change his mind, but he could likely beat said man into the ground if he insisted on being an idiot. And that was everyone. Sakonji finished that up and was about to close the letter, but Tanjiro stopped him. Urokudaki-sensei, I think now would be a good time for me to give up information on all the waxing moons, and most of the waning moons as well, if you'd like, even though Muzan usually kills them within the next 3 years for not being strong enough. The note of sadness and regret in the boy's voice worried Sakonji immensely. You know them all personally. Tanjiro's mouth tightened and his eyes remained fixed on the floor in front of him. I've met all of the waxing moons in my previous lives. I've not met all of the waning moons. As I said, they're usually gone by the time I am in a position to find them. Sakonji chose his next words very carefully. Do you care for them? The boy's hands fisted in the fabric of his hakama. That is a difficult question for me, Urokudaki-san, he said softly. Not sensei this time. The boy was treating him as an equal, as a fellow demon slayer. You must understand that most demons have not chosen to become so. Muzan simply sees an opportunity, someone can do that he would like to put to good use in favor of him and forcefully recruits them. That isn't the case with every demon. I think if a waxing moon tries to turn someone, They have to agree, but I'm honestly not entirely sure. In any case, Tanjiro continued before Sakonji could cut in an attempt to gain more information. A couple of lifetimes ago I challenged Waxing Moon 3 for the position once I was strong enough. Sakonji had to concentrate on not dropping his brush and ruining the letter. Had he just heard correctly? Waxing 3. He forced himself to ask, annoyed at how tightly his voice came out. If Tanjiro noticed, he didn't say anything. Instead, he nodded with a sigh. Yes, I challenged him because he tends to be the most straightforward in a fight. 4, 5, and 6 all have tricks that make their fights rather long. I don't want to go anywhere near 2 if I don't have to, and 1 can kill demons. I had made sure to sleep extra long that lifetime to gather enough power to do it. It still wasn't an easy fight, but I managed to beat him, if only barely. Everyone below 2 was not happy with me as they'd all been kicked down a position, and I had to put up with Akaza constantly challenging me to my place again and again. He shook his head. I wanted information. I got most of what I went for and more, but I wish I hadn't. The cost was far too high. You were a waxing moon, Sakonji had to ask, just to make sure he hadn't misheard. Tanjiro sighed. Yes, and I still regret it. Musen. He grit his teeth. The boy took several deep, calming breaths before he went on. When he did, he finally looked up at Sakonji. I think he's bored, honestly. Bored, addicted to power, convinced of his own superiority, and that he deserves anything other than being left to burn in the sun. Several more deep breaths. And he likes hurting people. No, he loves it. I think he saw me as a new play toy. He kept trying to pry into my background, but I managed to hide my family away. Not even I knew where they were that lifetime. That infuriated him and he punished me. The boy paused again, this time looking more than a little green, and he gulped as he looked down again, in shame or disgust. Sakonji didn't know. He gets creative when he's playing with people. He tries to make them hurt while persuading them he has already given them and will continue to give them everything they need. He screws with your head, and it's so hard to tell what's real and what isn't. He paused again and Sakonji let him gather himself, unsure of what to really say or think. Was this what it was like to be a waxing moon? Were they really such pitiful creatures? Finally, Tanjiro continued. I swore never to infiltrate the upper ranks again, especially when he killed me on a whim that time, just because I happened to be there at the wrong moment and was new. In my next life, though, once he turned me into a demon, the boy's throat cut off and he seemed to be forcing himself to breathe slowly. He must have gotten a memory from my time as a waxing moon because he came after me. Found me with my family and more breaths. I had to pledge myself to him to save them. The previous lifetime was nothing compared to that one. His voice cut off again. The same thing happened. Then his mouth opened and closed several times before Sakonji realized the boy had tears running down his 2 pale cheeks. Tanjiro shook his head, looking up with pleading eyes at his sensei. He made an entirely new rank just for me, not because I was that powerful, but B because he was convinced IW would conquer the sun for him. He wasn't wrong, per se. I have before conquered the sun as a D-demon. B but I made sure I didn't that time. I think he knew B because it just kept getting worse. The things HEM made me do just to key. Another deep breath that didn't seem to be doing much good. Keep them alive and then The boy faded off and Sakonji knew the boy was no longer there in his home just then. He'd seen demon slayers, veteran demon slayers, who would do this sometimes, relive particularly bad fights again and again. Seeing it on this boy, this former waxing moon. The boy shook his head again. I am sorry, B but I can't right now, Yurokudaki-sensei, he sobbed. I can't. Sakonji couldn't answer. He didn't really know what to say to this. He'd never been good with helping people through problems like this. The only thing he really knew to do at this point was a distraction. So he cleared his throat. What about the waxing moons? He asked calmly and then mentally kicked himself. That was probably not the best subject to approach at the moment. At the same time, that was definitely information they needed yesterday. He watched the boy carefully, deciding that if he did not react well to that, Sakonji would drag him out back for a spar. Thankfully, Tanjiro seemed to grasp onto the question and his eyes focused once again on Sakonji, seeming a little surprised at where he was. Good. That meant he was thinking and processing the here and now again. Hi, he said, his voice still a little shaky, but he took more deep breaths and they finally seemed to help him calm. Then he proceeded to speak about each and every one of the 12 Kazuki he'd encountered. He had details on their physical appearance, their abilities, their loyalties, and finally, how to kill them. Sakonji found it a great relief to know that enough poison could take out most of the waxing moons and that most of them were still subject to beheading. However, his description of Waxing Moon 1 almost had Sakonji throwing up. To think that a demon slayer, one of the first demon slayers, would willingly join that thing. Then Sakonji asked if Tanjiro knew where they could currently be found. When Tanjiro remained silent, the former water pillar looked over at him, concerned. The boy looked troubled, and then finally shook his head. I can't tell you where the Waxing Moons are. Sakonji frowned. Do you know where they are? I know where most of them can be found, he said evasively, or how to lure them out. The former pillar frowned under his mask, his hand inching towards his nearby sword. Are you protecting them? Tanjiro looked genuinely shocked at that. What? No, I want them taken out as much as anyone. Sakonji's hand relaxed. He smelled nothing but sincerity. But then he tipped his head to one side. Then why? He asked. The redhead sighed. Because the pillars aren't strong enough right now. Sakonji paused, blinking. Then he shook his head. If enough pillars form a group and have backup with lower-ranking members. Tanjiro cut him off. No, you don't understand. In my first life, Yuzui-san, his 3 wives, myself, my sister, and 2 of my fellow demon slayers were barely enough to take on Waxing 6. Yuzui-san still lost an arm and had to retire. Rengoku-san took on Waxing 3 when he attacked a train. He had myself and my friends as backup. But we couldn't do anything. The only reason everyone survived that was because it was close to dawn. Rengoku died protecting everyone in one of the largest shows of strength I've ever seen from a pillar. I'm positive he got his mark, but we just couldn't see it under the blood. The boy winced. Mark? Tanjiro blinked, then sighed again and pointed to his forehead where Sakonji could see a scar. The scar had taken on a rather strange shape and seemed a little darker than it had the day before now that the former water pillar thought about it. When demon slayers go above and beyond in a fight, survived a life or death situation where their heart rate reaches a certain level, they develop a mark. It can give a user enhanced speed and strength, allow them to literally see inside their opponents, and give their blades the coveted red color that hinders a demon's regrowth ability. Sakonji blinked. He'd never heard of such a thing. And only demon slayers can get this mark? He asked slowly. Tanjiro nodded, then paused. Well, only people who know a breath style. Waxing Moon 1 has won. This kept getting worse. In any case, Tanjiro's voice cut into his thoughts. The pillars need to train more before they're ready to take on any of the Waxing Moons. I'm pretty sure they could handle most of the waning moons right now though. Train more? Sakonji asked. Because pillars training constantly was a given. Tanjiro nodded. In each other's styles of training. That's how it worked before. Sakonji thought about having to train in the lightning or even stone styles and almost shuddered. That would be horrible for even a pillar, which, he supposed, was the point. He looked at the stack of papers for the letter that was already going to give his crow trouble, and realized he'd just have to go and speak to Yubayashiki-sama himself. I see. He turned to face his latest sheet of paper again. It looks like I will be leaving next week. It will be up to you to train yourself and your sister. What? But I've never done that before. Tanjiro protested. I'm still trying to get back into the swing of fighting like a demon slayer, and not a demon. Even if I did utilize breathing techniques. If what you say is true, you are plenty qualified to watch over her training for a week. A pause, then, yes, Urokudaki-sensei. Sakonji nodded firmly and picked his brush back up. Now, explain this mark again to me. It had been a while since Sakonji had seen the Yubayashiki head. He still remembered the boy's father, strict and a little bitter, but still utterly dedicated to eradicating Muzan. Oyakata-sama, though, had taken after his mother, choosing to be patient and understanding while still somehow proving to be just as dedicated. He'd never commanded respect like his father had. He'd just sort of earned it, and not just from Sakonji, which had been a lot of the reason why the former water pillar had made the trek all the way here just to go over Tanjiro's letter. It took Yubayashiki-sama about half an hour just to read what Sakonji had written while the older man sipped at his tea, with his mask pulled back from his face for once. When the demon slayer had finally finished, he put the paper down and just sort of stared at it for a while. Sakonji couldn't help but feel a little relieved that he wasn't the only one who felt like he'd been pulled in over his head. After several minutes of more silence, the dark-haired man lifted his eyes to meet Sakonji's. Kacho Shinobu is currently the insect pillar and has been for almost a year now. Sakonji withheld a sigh. So her sister, Yubayashiki-sama, nodded sadly. Yes, Kacho Kani, our former flower pillar, died 1.5 years ago. Sakonji nodded and they both had a moment of silence for the lost pillar. Eventually, the younger man spoke again. Shinazugawa-sanmei, Himejima Jayomai, Tenjin Yuzui, Rengoku Kyojiro are all current Hashira. The information here, he tapped the papers of the letter with one finger, about each of them is, indeed, correct. Iguro Obanai and Kenroji Mitsuri are both part of the core and well on their way to becoming pillars themselves, but the rest of the information is accurate. He paused and looked up at the former water pillar. You said yourself that the information on Tomioka Jiu is correct. Sakonji nodded. That has not changed and I cannot find any fault in his description of my student. Yubayashiki-sama nodded thoughtfully before continuing. The most curious case here is that of the child named Takedo Makairo. While I have never met him, he currently lives with his twin brother as their parents were killed by demons. He is currently 12 years old and not part of the Demon Slayer Corps. Given the rest of the information we have, I will keep a closer eye on them to try and prevent another tragedy. Well, Tanjiro may have prevented at least some death with his information, even if not the one he'd been hoping for. So, your conclusion, Oyakata-sama? He asked. More silence as the Yubayashiki head contemplated his question. There certainly is a great deal of information here, and I haven't even begun on the report about the 12 Kazuki. But what was your read on the boy? Sakonji paused and set his tea down carefully. Then he took a deep breath. I believe him. He shook his head. His reactions, his actions, and his utter loathing of Muzan. Those aren't emotions that can be faked. Not easily and not consistently. There are just too many things that don't add up otherwise. Yubayashiki-sama smiled gently at him. I happen to agree. I believe him as well. Only years of practicing constant breathing allowed Sakonji to not let out the breath he'd been holding loudly. But the relief he felt at the acceptance felt like a weight off of his shoulders. The younger man continued. I will request that the current pillars take time off to train in each other's styles and encourage the children under them to do the same. He eyed the former pillar, amused. That includes your children, you realize. Sakonji repressed a sigh, forcing himself to remain stoic as he nodded once. Yes, I know. Yubayashiki-sama's smile widened. Thank you, Sakonji, for both bringing this to me and for continuing to train new children. The former pillar replaced his mask and bowed deeply. It is my honor, Yubayashiki-sama. The younger man just smiled and nodded respectfully. Will you be returning home immediately, then? He asked. I can have someone prepare a room for you. Sakonji shook his head. That will not be necessary. I will be heading over to Rengoku's estate, actually. If I leave now, I will make it well before sunset. Yubayashiki-sama nodded knowingly. Very well. I will speed you on your way. But please, don't be too harsh on him. We all have our own obstacles. Sakonji didn't respond except to bow once more at Yubayashiki-sama before turning to walk out of the room. He made no promises as he wasn't entirely sure he could keep them. Omik, a cry of surprise and then pain had Kyojiro on his feet with sword in hand before he'd registered that he'd even moved. Disregarding that information as unimportant, he quickly ran out of the room and onto the Ingawa just in time to see his younger brother come out of his own room, looking around frantically. Kyojiro couldn't help but be impressed at his Otauto's own reaction times. Oni-san, he said, looking relieved. What was that? It sounded like father. Before Kyojiro could say anything, the sound of sword fighting drew both of their attentions to the side of the house. Stay here, the flame pillar instructed, then went to take a look. He'd only gone a couple of steps when a voice reached him. How dare you give up now? A man Kyojiro did not recognize yelled. And not only do you give up, but you insist on dragging your family down with you, simply because you can. Since when did you side with the demons? Father, Kyojiro called out. He'd almost reached the end of the Ingawa, gritting his teeth angrily. He may agree with the words, but that last one was going too far. He held his sword in his hand, ready to draw it, but before he could, two blurs rushed out from behind the house and into the training area in front. You have no right to say that. Kyojiro heard his father yell back. That made him stop. That was the most passion he'd heard in his father's voice for over a year now. You who have had only one student out of dozens even passed the final selection. But at least, the strange man in a blue haori and a Tengu mask swung in between each word. I, swish, never, clang, gave, whoosh, up. You have no idea what you're talking about. Kyojiro's father yelled back, swinging a sword with his signature fire techniques. Even retired and muscles practically rusted with disuse, the former flame pillar was a wonder to behold. The man in the Tengu mask was no slouch either, swinging his sword in a very familiar style. Was that Tomioka's water style? Don't I? The Tengu man returned. You never met a waxing moon. The head of the Rengoku family yelled between swings, dodging and blocking and parrying and attacking. I have. I met Waxing Moon 1 and I cannot describe the utter power that monster wields. He decimated the entire company in seconds, and the only reason I escaped was because the sun was rising and I could get high enough and far enough away in time. I was one of the strongest pillars and stood absolutely no chance. And if that is the case, then what is the point? Rengoku Shinjiro screamed as he put all of his effort and anger and fear into one attack. Kyojiro could practically see the pillar of flame rising from his father, and yet the Tengu masked man managed to weave around it, like the stream of a river. It was awe-inspiring and eye-opening. That was why he'd had a problem. Kyojiro had thought his attitude had begun to sour because of his mother's death. He distinctly remembered his father changing then, and it just never got better. But then he had trained with his father and little brother after their mother had died. It struck him as to how much he'd misread the situation. The more they went on, the more this sounded like a fight Kyojiro really shouldn't get involved in. And yet, he watched each move and waited, just in case. He may not be pleased with his father's actions right now, but he was still his father, and one of the people Kyojiro had vowed to protect. The point is to get stronger, the masked man said. And if you can't, then you make the next generation stronger, and let them grow, and acknowledge them, nurture them, love them, so that they'll be sent on missions they'll never return from. For no reason, the two traded blows for a couple of seconds before the masked man responded. And yet if you give up, Muzan wins. He will succeed and take everything you love from you anyway. At least this way I can keep them around a little longer. Enjoy it while I have it. But you're not. The two men broke apart, breathing heavily from either side of the yard as they faced each other down. The masked man was the first to speak. You claim that you love your children and yet you neglect or outright discourage them. You claim there is nothing we can do against the waxing moons. So you stop trying. The only person here who has condemned this family is you. And who are you to butt your long nose into my business where it doesn't belong? You have no right to be here. This is my family to lead as I see fit. Which you are only saying because you know I'm right. You don't know what I saw, Urokidaki. I know that Waxing One used to be a demon slayer. Kyojiro gasped, and behind him, he heard his little brother do the same. What? Who? Who would do such a thing? What kind of demon slayer would side with Muzan of all people? How? Utterly disgusting. I know he's almost as old as Muzan himself is. And I know that he has a breathing style unlike any we've ever seen before. I also know that he could decimate every single Hashira one-on-one to date. Kyojiro's father grit his teeth. Then why are you? But the man cut him off. Because that's what makes us different. That's why we can win. Because we aren't alone. Muzan has his demons, but ultimately they will look out for themselves over anyone else, as will he. But multiple Hashira working together can and will take down the 12 Kazuki and Muzan. The yard fell into silence as that statement rang through the field. Then Urokudaki spoke again, his voice quieter. But that's just it, we need you. We need a flame pillar to pass on everything, so if we cannot reach the kind of strength we need right now, we can teach what we have learned to people who can. You of all people know this more than anyone else. It was painful for Kyojiro to sit there and watch his father stand there looking like he wanted to hope but didn't dare as his arms shook in front of him. Whether from his first workout in a while or emotion, Kyojiro didn't know. They're so strong. And Muzan is even stronger, Kyojiro heard his father say. I don't want to send my sons into that. I don't want to lose them too. It both touched the current flame pillar that his father would say that about both of his sons, but also made him raise his hackles a little because he could take care of himself. He'd proven that. But you know that you can't stop them because you've raised good sons, Urokudaki responded. You've done a good job up until recently, Shinjiro. So you try to push them away to stop it from hurting if you lose them. I've seen it happen before. I've been there before. Fortunately, I had someone there to kick my sorry backside into shape because all you are doing, in the long run, is making everything worse. For you and for them. The man stepped forward, sword held out to the side in a show of non-aggression. Anyone would have been terrified to see what you saw. There is no shame in that. Anyone decent would have felt guilty for surviving when your comrades didn't. A wince from his father had Kyojiro almost gaping. He hadn't known his father had felt guilty. It is not your fault. You did the right thing by coming back to your boys because that is the best thing you can do to keep them alive. Give them a welcoming, happy home to return to, a place they want to come back to. I left them there, though. It is my fault. Kyojiro's father's voice cracked. Father, Kyojiro said quietly. He'd known his father had been hurting. But not like this. It is the demon's fault, and specifically Muzan's. Every life lost in demon slaying lies squarely on his shoulders and no one else's. And if you aren't strong enough, well, I have some training for you and your sons to go through. We can become stronger together and your children will be even stronger than we are. The silence felt heavy enough to be cut with a sword. Then the Rengoku head glanced over at his sons. But, he said softly, apologize to them. Even the best fathers make mistakes. Show them that you are sorry by trying once again to live up to the man you used to be. A snort, and Kyojiro could swear he heard his father holding back tears. I will never be that man again. Then be better, Shinjiro. Kyojiro's father's shoulders slumped and he shook his head. I'm too out of practice too. I give you 6 months. 6 months and then I will come and drag you to my mountain myself. Get yourself back up to strength in the meantime. And to Kyojiro's amazement and joy, his father laughed. It was a wet sort of pity laugh, but Kyojiro decided to count it as an immense improvement. He wasn't sure when he'd last heard his father laugh. Fine, stupid old Tengu, hot-headed newbie. The masked man had reached Shinjiro and sheathed his sword before putting his hands on the blonde man's shoulders. Good, come back from this, if only for them. It's the least you owe them. And Ruka, the Rengoku head, said softly. Kyojiro had to stop from choking on another gasp. He hadn't heard his father speak of his mother in years. And Ruka, Urokudaki, replied. She would have wanted me to beat some sense into you too. Another laugh from the younger man, and Kyojiro suddenly felt as if his knees had gone weak. He didn't know quite what to think of everything, of anything. At the moment, this just seemed so sudden. Then the masked man said, his voice almost too soft for Kyojiro to hear, we can do this, but only if we all do our part. This is the part you chose years ago. In all seriousness, will you swear to follow it again? His father slumped. I still think that we are fighting a losing battle. He shook his head. I just can't get that encounter out of my mind. But, he looked up. You are right. I chose this path, knowing the potential consequences. I will not give in to my fear again. Not like that. The tension finally left all of Urokudaki's frame. Thank you, old friend. He stepped back and turned to face Kyojiro and Shinjiro. Now, how about you introduce me to your sons? His father blinked and looked over at them guiltily. Then, a rather sly grin crept over his face. The sons of the family you just insulted? He asked. Urokudaki stepped back as if startled. What? What were the words again? Since when did you side with the demons? Now, wait a moment. Kyojiro caught on almost immediately. He was grateful to this man for what he'd done, certainly. But some of those accusations did not sit well with him, so he interrupted. Indeed, I am Rengoku Kyojiro, the current flame pillar, and as the head of the Rengoku family, I must challenge you to an honor duel. He said the whole thing with his signature smile. The fact that it was 100% real this time may have made it even wider and brighter than normal. Oni-san, he heard his brother whisper, unsure if he'd done so in awe or resignation. Not wanting to break eye contact, he decided to accept it as the former, and then moved on, striding forward. Urokudaki had turned back to Shinjiro, and while Kyojiro couldn't see it under the mask, he could almost feel the betrayal rolling off the man. Honestly, it was so amusing, he had to laugh. Please, put up a good fight, Urokudaki-san. Good luck, son, his father said on his way past, walking back towards the house. He also clapped Kyojiro on the shoulder. It didn't fix or excuse anything that had happened in the last several months. But it was a start. A wonderful, hopeful start. And Kyojiro vowed he would live up to his father's expectations and hold nothing back. The masked man sighed and then took a familiar stance. Very well. We will see how the current pillars measure up. And with that, the battle started. The old man was far too strong for anyone his age. The fact that they ended in a draw, more than anything else, convinced Kyojiro that the old man was right. He needed more training. This is the author note. If you want, you can skip. Notes, author's note, sorry, but I have got to rant about the timeline for in some of my issues with Demon Slayer. Firstly, it happens in the Taisho period. That begins in 1912, 2 years before World War I. Japan wasn't an enormous part of WWI like they were in WWII. But they were still a notable and noticeable presence. We hear nothing about said war in the series, though, so either KNY begins in the Meiji era, and we move into the Taisho era around the final selection, or it has to start after November of 1918. But again, we hear nothing about said war either way, and the farther we go into the 20s, the less it fits with the era of what we see. The Taisho era ended in 1926 as well, so the idea of them not mentioning a war at all seems strange, as it was a world war and still impacted whole economies of multiple countries, Japan included. Secondly, talk about child soldiers. I mean, Yubayashiki seems like a really great guy for a leader, but he also sends children to die on a mountain for a test. And then we get Hashira as young as 14. And that isn't a huge lead for a record in the series. What the actual? Grits teeth. So hunters have to kill a certain amount of demons and or fulfill a certain amount of missions to raise ranks. Okay, fine. People can hurry through ranks if they end up having several in a row quickly enough. Assuming Tanjiro, Inosuke, and Zenitsu remained approximately the same rank, they all got to Tsuchinoto pretty quickly, within a couple of months of passing their final exam. Although that begs the question, why are there hundreds of slayers when only 4 or 5 pass each final selection? And how often are these selections held? Once every month, once every other month, once every 6 months, once a year? We have no idea. Head desk. Then we get how fast they become pillars. The only way for someone to raise ranks quickly enough, such as Muakairo and Jayame, is for them to work non-stop for weeks in a row, and then face one of the 12 Kazuki. We know that Rengoku faced lower, waning 2 before he became a pillar, and when Muzan kills the lower, waning moons after Rui is taken out, there's a waning 2 that's very different from the one Rengoku faced. So I can kinda see Muzan's point in that at least 3 of them had to be completely replaced within the last 2 years. Still, this goes back to the point of if people progress so quickly, why aren't there more pillars? Why aren't there more higher ranked members period? I get this is a deadly job with a high turnover rate but I don't think that fits with everything we know. In any case, Hajime Jayame is the oldest of the Hashira at 27 when we first meet him. He's been a demon slayer long enough for both of the Kacho sisters to be rescued by him, then for Kani to reach the age of 17, become a pillar herself, and die, then Shinobu to reach the age of 18 when we first meet her. Yes, Shinobu is 18. Kenroji is 19. Both of the female pillars are under the age of 20. Very cool but still, so young. Most of the male pillars are 21. Now, how long they've all been pillars is up for grabs. The manga doesn't really say, but in the Rengoku Gaiden, there are only 5 pillars, unless all of the previous pillars got shunted out at about the same time. Then we've had 4 pillars all appointed any time within the 2 years before Tanjiro's final selection. Could be as early as 3 years because Kani is not there in the Gaiden and Shinobu is. Which begs the question of when did Shinobu become a pillar? She was 14 when Kani died. That happened about 3 to 3.5 years before we meet her at Mount Natagumo. Or are we talking 15, 16, immediately after? Okay, I do doubt Shinobu became a pillar earlier than 15 because Muakairo holds the record for the youngest at 14. So yeah, what about Shinizugawa? Yuzui is the second oldest at 23. And we just have no idea how long they've all been in their roles. All we know is that Rengoku, Kenroji, Obnai and Muakairo are the latest of the group to come in. But figuring all this out, this is so messed up. So basically, it's late, I'm trying to figure this out and annoyed, and while this isn't the worst timeline ever, but it certainly isn't the best either. And it's after 4 AM, please realize that. 6 months in, and Tanjiro was ready to go to the final selection. Or, in actuality, he was overqualified. With 2 breathing styles under his belt, his mastery of constant total concentration breathing, and a honed body from 6 months of constant practice, he'd almost reached pillar level. Everything about the situation boggled Sakonji's mind. He'd heard of geniuses rising through the ranks quickly, but this. Jiu would be upset that he didn't want to be the water pillar. But Sakonji secretly thought this would be better for both of his students. I'll train twice as hard, Nai-chan. Nezuko said, determination shining in her eyes. Me too. Takeo, who had only just started his own training, agreed. I think we all will, Kai said softly as she stepped in, likely preventing a cacophony of noises from the rest of the children. Her own training was coming along slowly, but surely. She seemed to be able to squeeze every last ounce of growth from her training sessions, and she joined the children in their swinging exercises every morning before starting on her own self-proclaimed duties. Sometimes he thought she progressed through sheer grit alone. Despite her outward appearance, the woman was no pushover. Between her efforts and the rest of the children's help, they now had a nice-sized house with 4 separate sleeping rooms, a cooking room and an ingawa. To Sakonji, it felt almost lavish, but it was necessary. He found, the more he got used to the children, the more he realized how lonely he'd been before and how much happier he was now with others around so often. Especially with an adult to interact with who had a good head on her shoulders. If he'd ever had a daughter, he would hope she could have been like Kamado Kai. Alright, everyone, Tanjiro said as he put Rokuta down after giving him a hug. Be good. I'll be back shortly. Good luck, Nai-chan. You'll do great. Come back safely. Love you. Tanjiro looked as if he'd been given the world. Still beaming, he set off waving while wearing that grin on his face. Fox mask tied to the side of his head and a borrowed Nichiren blade. Don't worry, Yurokudaki-sensei, I'll make sure you don't lose any more students to the final selection. Sakonji could only sigh, so he did no more about Subito and Makoto than he'd let on. Somehow, the former water pillar had never been able to bring himself to ask. He appreciated the boy's words. He did, but it still took him by surprise when Tanjiro showed how much he knew so casually. One can know something without fully understanding the repercussions, apparently. The worst part was Sakonji really should be used to it by now. Kai put a hand on the cultivator's arm, concerned, likely for Tanjiro more than him. Do you lose many children to the final selection? Sakonji sighed. Yes, I do. However, he glanced at the disappearing figure down the road and almost felt sorry for the demons trapped by the wisteria forest. I am sure he won't be one of them. And wasn't that a relief to say? Yamamoto Miroku hated this. He'd been training for years, had barely gotten to a point where he could use his chosen breath style at all. But here he was running from a demon with so many hands. There shouldn't be any demon this strong in the final selection. He'd tried to cut it, even with his wind-breathing style. But he'd cut off a hand and then made a few dents at the most. The neck hadn't even been scratched. And so he'd run. Why don't you just come back? The demon called to him. You can't outrun me. Miroku's stomach lurched and he jumped over a fallen log. He refused to just give up because otherwise what was it all for? But he knew he couldn't keep up this pace. He felt tears come to his eyes, but refused to acknowledge them. And his heart pounding so hard in his chest that it hurt. What else did he expect from running so hard? It certainly didn't stem from his fear. Also his legs and arms shook because he'd pushed himself for so long. And that was the only reason. And yet, in his heart, he knew, is this how I die? He asked himself, so close to the finish line. He went to take another step, but his foot caught on a branch he'd thought he'd stepped over and he went sprawling, scraping his palms, bruising his knees and losing hold on his sword. It took him a moment to realize what had happened, and dazed he looked up to see his sword ahead of him, lying on the ground. He went to crawl forward and grab it, but the voice of the demon behind him made him freeze in his tracks. Caught you? Miroku turned to look over his shoulder, eyes wide in horror. It happened as if in slow motion, as the world seemed to just freeze around him. And yet he couldn't make his body move to the side as the enormous hand came streaming towards his face. It caught him around the neck and lifted him into the air. You're not one of those children, but I'm sure you'll be tasty. Miroku couldn't breathe. The hand demon lifted him into the air, up and up and up until he hung right above the mouth. He glanced down and, in horror, saw the enormous maw stretch wide, a gaping hole ready to literally swallow him up. No, he gasped, his hands grasping at the demon's appendage. It didn't do any good. He kicked, but the demon's grip held strong. No, please. And then something blurred out of the corner of his eye. Breath of water, second form, water wheel, someone said as the blur got between Miroku and the hand demon. An unearthly scream and someone grabbed the back of Miroku's shirt, dragging him along. The demon's hand let go and the next thing he knew he sat on the ground near his sword, his backside hurting. He blinked, looked up, and saw the smiling face of a burgundy-haired boy. He couldn't be older than 13, 14 at the most, and yet he grinned down at Miroku like he could see nothing wrong with the situation at all. Are you okay, Slayer-san? What? Oh, ho, ho. It's one of his. He sent another one to me this year, the demon said excitedly. The boy's eyes closed and he somehow seemed sad as he turned to face the demon. The Yorokudaki. He trapped me here and sends me food. I don't know whether to hate him or thank him. The demon looked contemplative, then grinned at them. No, I hate him. I hate him. I hate him. He trapped me here. The demon yelled and his hands shot forward. So in revenge, the boy dodged and the demon grew more hands. I'll devour all of his students. The boy evaded him again. Too bad you missed one, he said with that same smile. His words didn't match his tone, but he didn't sound insincere or forced at all. This was one creepy kid. The hand demon screeched and lunged forward again. But the kid practically disappeared and then appeared again on a tree behind said demon. I'm glad I'll be able to give you peace earlier this time around. He practically disappeared again, and then Miroku heard it, first form, water surface slash. Then a flash of light glinting off of a moving sword and the demon's head went flying. Miroku could only kind of sit there with his jaw hanging open as the demon's head fell to the ground, already starting to slowly disintegrate. Then, to Miroku's ever-growing amazement and utter confusion, the boy appeared between the head and body. For a moment, he just looked on, eyes so sad, over a demon. And then Miroku's brain stopped working altogether as the boy knelt down and put one hand on the demon's head and the other in a nearby hand. How old were you when that man found you? He whispered softly. 6, 7. Miroku's eyes widened. It was. He'd never thought of it that way before. Then the demon cried out Oni-chan and somehow, he knew the red-haired boy had not been far off. Miroku remembered his own little brother, chomped practically in half by a demon as his mother screamed. The demon hadn't been interested in either of them, only in Yasumaru. His mother hadn't been able to cope afterwards and had just sort of wasted away. His father, well, the less said about the man that abandoned them, the better. And yet, what if Yasumaru had been turned into a demon instead? That hand demon that had almost eaten him. That had been someone's little brother too. He felt sick, not really knowing what to think about this new revelation. Demons were evil, but they'd once been human. Demons needed to die, but they'd had family who loved them once. For so long, Miroku had just thought of demons as not human anymore and thus not human at all. But that wasn't the case, was it? He didn't like this new perspective. It made his head hurt and his stomach roll. So he ignored it, and instead, he spoke up angrily. "Hey, what was that all about?" he asked angrily. "You come in like I needed to be saved and then you hold that demon's hand. What is wrong with you?" The boy just turned and looked at him, that sunshine smile of his replaced by something blank but heartbreaking somehow. "Becoming a demon is a fate worse than death," he said softly, surely, like he already had so much slaying experience. Maybe he did, for all Miroku knew. Beholden to that man who can, and likely will, kill them on a whim, whether they want to be or not, unable to go into the sun, unable to resist their inherent hunger, unable to remember most of their lives as a human and much of it as a demon, all in exchange for a little power. He looked down at the piles of ash that was all that remained of the demon. They don't even leave a body to bury when they do die. He sighed. Were you in their position, especially if not by your own choosing as this boy was, would you not want someone there to ease your passing? But they've killed people." The boy nodded in agreement. "They have." Then he shrugged and turned to walk away. "However, if I had been in his position, I would have wanted someone to hold my hand and maybe pray over me. The only reason I'm not in his position is because I've never met Kibutsuji Musen. And I don't think that's a reason to deny someone a dying comfort." When he put it like that, how utterly terrifying to think that if Miroku had met Musen himself, he may find himself going out and hunting down people to stay alive. Would he enjoy it? He really hoped not. In any case, stay alive, the boy said as he walked into the trees. The rest of the demons here aren't that bad, and the demon slayers will need you in the future. What? Him? Why him? And yet, Miroku felt himself puff up just a little more at the acknowledgement. "Oh, of course you'll need me," he called after the disappearing figure. "Demon slayers need to be strong like me." The boy sighed something that sounded like wind users, but before Miroku could get defensive, the boy just said, "Good." For some reason, that just took the wind right out of Miroku's sails. Wait," he called, running after the boy a little to keep him in sight. "What's your name?" The boy paused and glanced back at him, that sunshine smile back in place. "Tanjiro. Kamado Tanjiro. Nice to meet you. Yamamoto Miroku." The trainee introduced himself quickly. Then he braced himself, but forced himself to grumble. "Thank you for the help." Then, much louder, "Just know I won't need it again." Tanjiro blinked, but then grinned even bigger somehow. "I'll hold you to that. Get stronger, Yamamoto-san. I look forward to seeing what you'll become." Funny, he hadn't had anyone to really believe in him since his family. He'd been mediocre at learning that wind style and his teacher had helped when asked, but otherwise simply left him to his own devices. He hadn't really made friends while training. He hadn't had a connection in so long. It felt good. He determined right then and there that he would live up to this boy's expectations and do everything he could to make it through the final selection. And whatever came after. "I'll see you around, Yamamoto-san," Tanjiro said, then turned to walk away again. A couple of minutes later, Miroku still stood in the small clearing wondering what had really just happened. Kibutsuji Musen didn't sleep often. Sleep was, after all, a vulnerability and weakness that others would simply take too much advantage of. He would not invite a proverbial knife to the back, as useless as any such attempt would be. He was a demon. The demon, superior, nigh perfect, almost unkillable, and most definitely not stupid. However, he did still, on the rare occasion, get bored. He avoided being trapped in small places for the day, but there were days he simply couldn't avoid it. During those times, he slept. And when he slept, he dreamed. The last time he'd been forced into such an undesirable circumstance had been when he'd gone to track down the potential Hanafuda family. It had just been a rumor, but he'd long since stopped dismissing rumors. And that one had been juicy enough to investigate himself. It hadn't taken him terribly long to track down. A couple of years at most once he'd initially heard the rumor. One of his demons had found a stall selling earrings, and Musen had caught a glimpse of it. Several pairs of earrings were Hanafuda earrings. Needless to say, the shop had been destroyed that night and the man had been forcefully recruited to the side of the demons. He'd searched through all of the memories as his connection to his new demon grew, and found images of the man he'd bought said earrings from. Musen had let him go after that and then watched as the man killed and devoured what had been his family before running for the hills. Musen always enjoyed watching that, watching the absolute proof of how superior demons were to the weak humans. Unfortunately, the merchant family that had sold the earrings to the stall owner had been more difficult to track down. But once he had, he'd learned of the artisan from a mountain village who had seen a man wearing the earrings. Apparently the man had been inspiring and most definitely using a sort of watered-down version of a breath form, even if he hadn't been a demon slayer. Once he'd finished going through the traveling artisan's memories, the new demon had been set upon the nearest village, and Muzin had gone after the man from the memories, who apparently had a family in the mountains. He'd been so close to finding whatever trace of that man that had been left in the world and utterly destroying it. And he was positive he'd found the correct house, but it lay empty, cleaned out as if whoever had been living there had packed and left in a hurry. Now very angry, Muzin had tried to track them and had found a trail leading to a small dock in a nearby river, which had made the trail more difficult to follow but not impossible. So he'd followed the river and come across a set of tracks leading off and into the woods. Speedily, he'd followed them only to find a dead end. With his absolute wrath growing, he'd headed back to the river and found the second set of tracks only a little further down. This one had led back to the river, circling around some rapids. The third set, however, had led off into the trees towards the nearby village. It, too, was a dead end. Many trees fell to his rage at that. He'd been gone more than half the night by that point, drawing closer to 3/4. If he'd been simply traveling, he could have gotten to the village very quickly. However, he'd been tracking, and he hated how that had taken up far more time than it really should have. Although, now that he concentrated, he could sense the sort of split on the bank where they had apparently landed, laid a false trail, and then returned to continue down the river. If he didn't know any better, he'd think they had known he would come for them. But how? He'd been more determined than ever to find the humans, so much so that when he'd come across the next branch of the scent and lingering trace, it had been in the middle of a town port. Muzin had definitely stopped at a deserted dock and sensed that sort of branch, one heading down the river and the other into town. What clever humans. He may have to actually turn them, if he didn't initially slaughter them all out of sheer frustration. Still, he'd known where to go after that, focusing on following the trail down the river. That had been the only reason why he hadn't completely obliterated the town. Nigh unto dawn, he'd found the boat caught circling around and around in an eddy, completely empty but smeared with blood on the inside. The entire landscape had been rearranged at that discovery, and, unfortunately, Muzin didn't have time to go back and track. Not when he'd been heading northwest and would likely run into the sun if he went northeast. He'd probably get back to the village on time. But he'd never been one to take enormous chances, so he'd searched for shelter and found an abandoned house. For hours, he'd seethed. Even if he went back now, the trail would be cold at best, non-existent at worst. He'd already been able to tell the family hadn't stayed in the town. Now he was back to square one, and he hated it. Him, such an advanced being, reduced to chasing after a bunch of human brats. Eventually, the rage had faded into a frustrated boredom, and then he'd fallen asleep and dreamed. He dreamed of demons and demon slayers, of a family running, of looking down at hands and expecting to see claws but only seeing fingernails, of children yelling out Tanjiro Nai, or Oniai-san, or even just Tanjiro. He also heard Nezuko, but little else, although he did get glimpses, impressions, really, of the waxing moons and incredibly strong humans with breath styles, but nothing particularly concrete. When he'd woken, he'd had to return to Tokyo to keep up appearances, which frustrated him further after the dream. He had to find this boy, this Tanjiro. His dreams always meant something, after all, even if only glimpses from his demons. Now, as he stood over the still cooling bodies of the couple that had been living in the way station, he realized he'd lost his chance to find the boy again. He'd tracked the family, but it hadn't done any good. Any leads had only led him to more dead ends. Wherever they'd gone, they'd taken a convoluted route to get there, which, of course, begged the question of how they knew they were being hunted. That, in turn, made him want them more. He refused to believe this farce of a chase was a coincidence. Unfortunately, he'd traced them to this place, and the only one in the know, the woman of the household, had refused to speak. And she couldn't hold his blood either. Normally, he'd think that a pity at best. But right now, the only reason he didn't tear the house down around him was the lightening of the horizon he could see outside of the window. He growled, the sound low, deep, feral, and full of promise. He would find this Tanjiro, and if he could, the family, and he would either end them or recruit them. Until then, it seemed he'd have to go back to searching for his blue spider lily, but he would likely be trapped in this house for the day. How unfortunate, but he could sleep and perhaps dream again. Besides, he thought as he eyed the bodies now leaking blood into the tatami mats, at least I have a good meal here. Kamadokai had always been a simple, practical woman. She had her priorities, her children, her husband, other people, herself, her home, and then everything else. When her husband, Tanjiro, had passed, she'd been right there by his side. He hadn't woken up to give her a final farewell. He'd just slowly stopped breathing those painful, raspy breaths. They'd buried him next to his parents, and it had almost killed her to say goodbye so soon. But she found her priorities hadn't shifted much in her life following. It hadn't been easy, but they'd managed and fallen into a sort of routine where each of the children pitched in when and where they had to, usually with time to play afterwards. She'd been immensely proud of them. Even little Rokita had found ways to help. Often his helping hindered more than it actually helped, but he was trying, and that was enough for her. All of her children had been hard workers, happy and loved. Losing their father had left an enormous hole in all of their lives, but they'd pressed on. And she'd felt so blessed to have such wonderful children come to her. Then Tanjiro had changed. In one day, one night even. The day he'd half stumbled, half ran out of their house and into the morning snow without any of his winter protection, in his sleeping clothes, and he'd come back so different. The stark contrast between her innocent, naive, optimistic child and the hardened warrior that had returned. He was still her Tanjiro, but at the same time, he wasn't. She'd known it then, but the months since had only reinforced her observations. She would never have thought to catch her son looking at his own hands in disgust, as if he could see something on them no one else could. Blood, dirt, claws, a combination thereof. She could never bring herself to ask, though. It reminded her too much of when her father had come back from the war with Russia. He'd had a similar look, and had been missing a leg. Sometimes he'd just stare at where his leg should be with a sort of longing that she'd thought initially meant he wanted his leg back. Understandably so, in her opinion. But later, after his death, her mother told her it had been more complicated than that. He felt like he hadn't given enough at times. Like maybe if he'd given up more of himself, that more of his comrades would have come home. She'd hated seeing that look on him, and hated seeing it on her son more. And then there were times Tanjiro would just stare at her with the most pained expression. She wasn't sure what exactly about her seemed to hurt him so much. When he looked at his brothers and sisters, he just seemed sad. But it was like something about her physically hurt him. She hated that too, but he wouldn't talk to her about that either. Or anyone, really. Not the few times she'd managed to muster the will to try. Except Nezuko. He'd talk to Nezuko. Just, not about anything he seemed to really need to talk about. And the rest of the time, it was like someone had taken her Tanjiro's personality and intensified it tenfold. He went from being happy and content and optimistic to practically beaming with that grin of his, excitedly rushing around when doing his chores or just interacting with his siblings and Urokudaki, and looking at the future with a sort of desperate determination bordering on fanaticism. No, it had crossed the line between fanaticism and normalcy long ago, she suspected. All of his energy and effort seemed to either go into interacting with his siblings or training to defeat this mutant person. And he seemed to have forgotten that he could no longer go without food or sleep. It scared her, mainly because Tanjiro had never been one to hide his feelings. He wore his heart on his sleeve, and every single one of the emotions he showed was real and genuine. Every smile, every grin, every sigh of contentment. If he'd been a sun lighting their lives before, he'd almost become a summer sun now. He'd been warm, but now his heat and light grown to a point of trying to scorch away any darkness from their lives. He was burning himself out, and it would kill him. She couldn't help her concern for him. She also worried about the effect his new personality had on his siblings. Nezuko was already pushing herself to the limit to learn the breath of water style. Takeo, as lazy as he could be, had to push himself to start his training and chores, but once he got into it, he could be more intense than Nezuko, just about as intense as this new Tanjiro, even. Hanako had already started asking when she would start training, as had Shidru, and even little Rokita liked to pick up a stick and swing it like his siblings did their wooden swords. Kai herself was making more progress than she realized. According to Urokudaki, she may only climb the mountain once or twice a week, but she did so every week, and concentrated on her breathing whenever she could. She hadn't progressed nearly as far as her children, though, and knew she likely never would. That was honestly alright with her as long as she could defend herself and her children somewhat. Still, unlike her children, she knew how to stretch herself without pushing herself further than she could handle. She'd had some success when stepping in with Nezuko and Takeo, but not Tanjiro. She'd tried to get him to rest more, gotten Nezuko to step in when she could, persuaded his siblings to ask him not to push himself so much. But then he'd just turn his energy on them and push himself that way. Eventually, she'd gone to Urokudaki. She was both more worried and relieved when she found out he'd apparently also tried to get him to stop as well. Neither one alone had been enough, it seemed. So, together, she and the cultivator made plans, then contingencies, and then they'd confronted Tanjiro. They had set some firm boundaries and restrictions on his training, both of them reminding him that no matter what he remembered from his other lives, he was hurting himself now by not resting. He was human right now, and that included physical weaknesses. Urokudaki had then told him outright he would not okay him for the final selection until he learned to relax and rest. Once he managed to do that often enough, they would only okay him to become a demon slayer if he could promise he would continue to allow himself time to recover after he'd passed the final selection. That more than anything else had gotten to him, and she'd finally seen an improvement in how he treated himself. She could only hope he would keep his promise and continue to take care of himself when he became a demon slayer, that he would stop punishing himself. She'd reminded him that he couldn't save everyone, and that trying too hard to do so would just hurt him, and anyone he could have helped more. That seemed to help him too. Kai hated putting so much on her 13-year-old son. No matter how many lives he'd lived, he was still 13. No matter how many memories he had, he'd never reached the age of 20. No matter what else he'd done, he was still just Tanjiro, the little boy who used to beg her for rice crackers and who loved watching his father dance and who would jump on his younger brother to take a burning pot to the forehead for him. If anyone could give her hope for the future, it would be him. He had the knowledge and understanding far beyond his years. He had the scars and trauma that no one of any age should have. He was the sun breaking through the clouds, but also the sun scorching the earth around him at times. And he was her son. And she hated having to let him go so soon just as much as she'd hated letting go of his father. But she knew she had to. Far too early, but it had to happen. And she could be grateful she was alive to be there when he left for the final selection. She had to hold herself from running out to meet him once he returned, practically skipping along and whistling a song she'd never heard before. Everyone ran up to greet him, and finally he reached Kai. He grinned up at her, without a scratch on him, and threw his arms around her. She immediately returned the embrace and held him close to her, tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm home, Mom," he whispered. "Welcome back, dear one," she replied in the same tone. "I passed, you know." Her breath hitched for just a moment, but then she forced herself to relax, pushing past her heartbreak at him growing up so soon as it reared its ugly head. "I know." He leaned back and looked up at her. When had he gotten so tall? "Are you proud of me?" he asked, worriedly. He must have smelled her sadness. She sighed and rubbed a hand over his short hair. "Oh, my dearest, you could fail every test in the world and I would still love you. But yes, I am proud of you. You never have to question either of those. Her breath caught again and she had to stop herself from just bursting into tears right then and there. "You're so young." He opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off. "I know you have several lives behind you, but my dearest, your body is 13. I wish I could keep you with me and safe forever. That is what any good mother would want for her child. But I know it isn't possible." She took out a small protection charm she'd gotten from the nearest Shinto temple. "So here is your welcome home gift. Whenever you see it, remember me, remember us all, and how much we love you." He took it with careful hands and then clutched it to his chest. "Hi," he said, then quickly tied it to the sash around his waist. "What is that, Nai-chan?" Shidru asked. "Can I see it?" Hanako butted in. Me too, Rokuda insisted. "Huh? Where was Takeo?" Kai looked around and saw Urokudaki practically dragging the boy back to training while he held his arms out for them. It was a good thing he couldn't cry on demand or he'd have false tears running down his cheeks. She shook her head fondly and gestured for him to go with his sensei. "So," she said as she turned back to her eldest, "come inside and tell us what it was like while I finish cooking dinner." He grinned and looked down at his siblings. "Who else wants to come listen to me talk about the final selection?" he asked. "Me." 3 young voices cheered. They all filed inside and Tanjiro gladly spoke of the walk he'd taken, the people he'd met and the end of the exam. She noticed that he rarely spoke of the demons he killed, except to say that he'd fought them, won and prayed for them. She wasn't sure what to think of that last one. Demons were evil, according to Urokudaki, and yet Tanjiro had been one and still retained his own kind nature. They killed and ate people, and yet he felt sorry for them and knew their plight. They fought and destroyed, he protected by taking their head. But he prayed for them. She decided that every time she prayed after that, she would include a thought for all demons who had died that day. Somehow, she suspected few else would, but she would. For Tanjiro, Hagenzuka Hataru didn't really like people. To be fair, people didn't really like him either, so he didn't see much of a reason to try and change it. But his general dislike morphed into outright loathing when people pushed that dislike onto his swords. They didn't have to like him to appreciate the fine craftsmanship that shone in his work. He didn't really care if they didn't like him, but to not like his swords. They were innocent in all of this, and they were very good swords. He made sure of it. So when demon slayers tended to ask for other swordsmiths, he felt both relieved that he didn't have to deal with such idiots who couldn't see or understand true beauty when they saw it, but also sad that, well, they couldn't see true beauty when they saw it. Rejecting his swords was far worse than rejecting him ever would be. As such, he tended to make blades for beginners, people who had just passed the final selection. A man of his talents. Honestly, it made his blood boil every time he thought about it. And yet, every time, he couldn't help but hope that this next one would be one of the few good eggs in the world. That they'd see how amazing his work was, or at least be appreciative. But no one had as of yet. Still, he could hope, he supposed. He didn't like to hope, though. People always destroyed it. There was one reason why he disliked people in general. However, he still longed to make the sword that would take a demon slayer up the ranks to become a hashira, to be numbered among the best. Maybe this new kid would be the one. Then he'd met said new kid and didn't really know what to think. The boy was, for lack of a better word, bright. The kind of bright that made Hotaru either want to shy away or attack. Because no one that bright was ever honest. And yet the boy was. Somehow he could tell that too. But he didn't know how else to treat said boy. Or his family. Hotaru decided almost immediately that he disliked brats more than he disliked people. They asked questions he didn't want to answer. And they didn't stop. Still, they all had some kind of red coloring somewhere in them, but the boy he'd made the sword for, the one with the red hair and eyes, would surely be the one who turned Hotaru's work of art into the coveted red blade. But it had been black, the very opposite of the impression the boy gave off. And very much not red. Not red, just another letdown. He should have known. And he may not have reacted well. Jumping at the boy like that didn't mean his sister and brother had to attack him and then get between him and the boy, which only frustrated him more. After some rather loud arguments, some nasty glares, and the demon slayer he'd given the blade to trying to mediate, everyone finally calmed down again. Then the kid said something about sun breathing, and that was why his blade was blackened. Honestly, Hotaru had just had enough by that point. Was sun breathing even a form? Shouldn't it be some sort of derivative of flame? Why was he here with the water cultivator? He doubted the boy would make it as far as a hashira. Yet another disappointment. At least the boy had still thanked him for the sword, so not a complete letdown. And yet, he paused in his stomping on the roundabout road leading to his village to look back over his shoulder towards Urokudaki Sakonji's place of residence. At least 2 of those kids had been training. Perhaps they would produce the red blades. And if he started on those blades now, really taking his time to sharpen them. Yes, that might work. And it would give him an excuse to not have to interact with anyone who wasn't an actual swordsmith. With a new skip in his step, he picked up his pace and hurried back home. He did, after all, have lovely, perfect swords to make. Nezuko hadn't had a chance to talk to her brother often since he'd come back from the final selection. But she had made sure to take him aside and insist on speaking with him. She asked him how he was doing and he assured her he'd been fine. And yet, Tanjiro, she said softly, I know Kasen spoke with you, but I worry. You're going to be going and killing demons. He sighed. Yeah, I am. Although, to be fair, even as a demon I killed other demons. Usually found a Nichiren blade. They, sadly, aren't that difficult to come by if you know where to look. He paused, and that sad expression she hated to see on him fell over his face. But then he shook his head and the smile came back. It didn't do a lot to quell Nezuko's worry. She wished she could go with him so badly. In any case, it brings them more peace than you may realize. I like using gentle rain if I can. It's quick and painless and he took a deep breath. I know they've done terrible things. I know they need to be stopped. But it isn't uncommon for it to not be their fault. They have new instincts and few remember any reason to fight them. Even you and I, the first time we were both turned. He faded off, looking down. Nezuko felt sick. The very idea that she'd been turned made her stomach twist into knots. The idea that Tanjiro had been turned made her even sicker. That he'd been a waxing moon. She'd asked Urokudaki-sensei about those and she knew Tanjiro had gone through worse than she could possibly imagine. She hated that her brother seemed to be keeping that back. To protect them, nonetheless. She had a feeling that it would get harder as time went on and that eventually it would make protecting them harder too. So she had to become a good demon slayer before that happened. So that he would trust her. Either that or get him to talk about it every now and then. Even if he found it painful. But only when he was ready to share it. But he would be gone. And she really hated this whole situation. Why couldn't Muzan have just left them alone on their mountain? They wouldn't have grown up learning how to fight with swords. They would have just lived. She wanted to make him regret that mistake more than anything else, except protecting her family. Demons, Tanjiro went on, slowly, people being turned into them. That's the worst part. More often than not, it's like the best part of them just vanishes, all those memories. It took me too many times to learn how to resist that. And my way of trial and error isn't exactly something other demons can use. No, she supposed it wasn't. Losing the memories. That's worse than being so fundamentally changed. Your memories make you who you are, and Muzan taking that away. He grit his teeth and looked away. Determinedly, Nezuko reached down and grabbed his hand, holding it and squeezing it tightly. We'll get him, Onii-chan. This time, I'm sure of it. Tanjiro looked down at their hands, blinking, before looking back up at her with the soft, warm smile that he so rarely showed these days. Then he reached up and patted her hair. She squawked and glared at him. He just smiled. Yeah, we will. Just don't take risks, she insisted. Assume he's after us, after you. Be careful, Onii-chan. And she paused, biting her lip. Come home, Onii-chan. Losing you would hurt us just as much as losing us hurt you. For several seconds he just stared at her, but then he reached forward and pulled her into a hug. Never change, Nezuko. And I promise I will be as cautious as I can and come home. She clutched at his haori, the typical black and green checkered one, not the blue one Urokudaki-sensei had given him. It smelled like him, like safety. I love you, Nai-chan, she whispered. I love you too, Imoto-chan, he said back. They just sat there for an undefined amount of time before he finally stood back, looking more at peace than she'd seen him since that day. I have to go, he said. Come back to visit often, she said. He smiled. I'll do my best. She frowned, but realized that would be the best she'd get out of him before nodding. I'm going to go train. Say goodbye to everyone else before you leave. He chuckled. Of course. Train hard, Nezuko. She nodded firmly. Hi, Onii-chan. With that, she turned and headed to the training ground behind the house to practice her swings as she'd just come down from the mountain. She was getting faster at it, even if the traps had gotten more deadly lately. She had to push herself so she could go out and fight with her Onii-chan. Because they were family, and just as he would never abandon them, they wanted to support him. That's what real family does. Yubayashiki Kaguya looked over the most recent reports with a soft, sad smile. He couldn't help but be sad. Even the reports of success revolved around death. Every time he thought about how Muzan marked people for death simply by turning them into demons, and for those around said demons to die even faster and often more gruesome deaths. It hurt. Still, he couldn't help but be so proud of the people who risked their lives. Many would even volunteer for it, although he insisted on paying them for such a dangerous, unforgiving job to stop the demons. It was inspirational to see. People who had often been through pain themselves risked so much to stop other people, strangers they'd never even met, from experiencing that pain. It was, in a word, incredible. He just wished that they didn't have to rise to the occasion. A jolt of pain shot through his head and he had to close his eyes. Rubbing at them gently, he sighed. His father had gone blind rather early on in his life. Kaguya knew he'd likely be losing his own eyesight soon, and while he hated that thought, he didn't see much of a point to rage against something he couldn't change. He'd simply have to find workarounds. Until then, though, he would do his work and go over the reports sent to him. He made some notes to send a rank Kano or higher to check out some rumors of a forest where people disappeared at night a couple of days' travel south, and moved on to the next report. This one came from Kamado Tanjiro. He didn't quite know what to think of that particular child. The child who claimed to be from the future and certainly had proof. This child who Urokudaki Sakonji, one of his strongest and most down-to-earth former pillars, believed. And he'd certainly not given Kaguya any reason to disbelieve him either. He was remarkably good at gathering information about demons. That he didn't simply take care of himself. He was also remarkably good at hunting demons, and the rate at which he was climbing the ranks. Well, he wouldn't be a Hashira in 2 months as Haimjima-san had, but it would be close. Or, it would be if Tanjiro wanted to be a Hashira. Apparently, he'd asked that he not be considered for the position as he felt he'd already drawn too much attention to himself from Muzan. He was willing to take up all the duties thereof, though, including taking a Tsuguko for anyone who would be willing to learn the second sun breathing technique. Kaguya had to admit, having somebody out there just as competent as any pillar pick up the slack while the rest of the Hashira took turns training with each other had been a boon he hadn't really expected. He'd take any good news at this point. Actually, he had a couple of assignments that would probably require Hashira. Like the boat problem, a couple of the ferries that tended to see higher volume would get lost on rivers and in bays, and no one could find any trace of any of them. Entire groups of people would just vanish. Kaguya had sent some lower ranks to investigate, but they either hadn't discovered the problem or hadn't come back. He'd been contemplating sending in one of his pillars the next time he could schedule it in. But, making up his mind, he quickly jotted down the message and sent word to his Kasugai crow to pass the message on. Then he made notes and moved on to the next report. Tanjiro stared at his hand as he waited for the ferry boat that would take him across the Seto Inland Sea to Shikoku. He found himself doing that a lot since he'd returned this time around, staring at his hands. They looked so normal, but they didn't feel normal. Not for him. This loop had been the longest he'd remained human since the first time around, and honestly, he loved it. Not being a demon had its drawbacks, but it had so many more positives. He didn't have to watch his thoughts in fear of drawing Musen's attention. He didn't have to worry about drawing attention by overcoming the curse too soon. He didn't have to worry about the sun or hiding from the rest of the Demon Slayer's core. But best of all, he didn't have to ignore that longing hunger in his gut that never really went away. It was always worse before his body changed, but it was always still there. Sometimes he didn't know how Nezuko had always been so strong that first time. The problem was, he was pretty sure he'd been a demon far longer than he'd been human at this point in the resets, which had to be the reason why his skin, sometimes, felt too small, constricting. Why he still preferred to avoid the sun at its peak, why he sometimes got a whiff of blood and had to brace himself for just a moment. He wasn't used to being human anymore. Yet another thing Musen had taken from him. He clenched his fist and looked up. His eyes searched the dock he waited on, surrounded by a couple dozen people. He saw traveling merchants ranging from a lone person to a group of 8, and some pack animals. He saw some random travelers, perhaps heading over to see family, just to get away and start a new life in a new area. Perhaps traveling to simply see the sights. He didn't know. However, most of the people seemed to be lower middle class and lower class. Exactly the kinds of people who had been disappearing on ferries recently. The boat they would be traveling on sat at the dock already, waiting for the sailors to finish preparing. There weren't many as it wasn't a particularly large boat, but as Tanjiro's eyes swept over them, he recognized something, a sort of hopeless desperation that tore at his heart. Withholding a sigh, he reached into the pocket of his trousers and withdrew the ticket he'd had to purchase for the boat. He sniffed it again and nodded. He'd lost count of how many times he'd double-checked, but he definitely recognized the scent. It made sense, really. Trains weren't always around and the demon in question had to get to Waning Moon status somehow. Sometime in the next couple of years, he must have ditched the ferry boat scheme and moved on to trains, either because he figured he could get more people that way or he wanted to throw off the trail of demon slayers. And since Tanjiro didn't have any backup this time, he'd potentially have to fight without his eyes. On the water, at night, he already had a blindfold ready, but that didn't mean he was looking forward to it. He did wonder if he plugged his ears, could he avoid the demand to go to sleep? It might lessen the effects, but would that be worth it? The demon he remembered had never been much of a fighter, preferring to stick to underhanded tricks and special abilities. Just the opposite of Akaza, of course. He stuck his hand in his other pocket and relaxed a little. He'd stuck his Hanafuda earrings in there and wrapped his hair up under a Sujigasa. He wanted to look as nondescript as possible so as not to attract attention from Musen. Then he looked up at the sky, slowly darkening as daylight faded. A cry from the boat pulled his attention back to it. One of the ferrymen called out for all to come forward and present their tickets. That meant Tanjiro would likely have to fall asleep again to give Enmu time to bond with the boat, get overly confident and show himself. He both was and wasn't looking forward to it. He wondered if his dream had changed. What would it say about him if it had? Did he want to know how much he'd changed? Perhaps he could simply sniff out Enmu and kill him immediately. But doing so in such a small place without hurting the passengers or crew would be difficult enough if they were all asleep. If he went after Enmu immediately, they would all panic and may not trust him. He'd definitely have to fight the sailors, who Enmu had likely already brainwashed, blackmailed or promised dreams to, and he couldn't allow himself to kill any humans. Ever, not after. He shook his head, focusing back on the line that had formed to get onto the ship. One particularly dour-looking man took the tickets and, yes, punched them. There would likely be a delayed reaction, but somehow, he couldn't help but think that the spell would make everyone very drowsy very quickly. And likely, Tanjiro had already been marked as a demon slayer. He really needed to speak to Yubayashiki about going around out of uniform. He'd have less physical protection, but it would be worth it to avoid problems like this. The man didn't even give him a second look as he punched the ticket and turned to the next person. Interesting, but not enough to really draw Tanjiro's attention. He could already feel the spell taking hold of him, and he could fight it, but that might just draw more attention to him. It didn't take him long to decide that he knew how to get out of the dream state, and while it wasn't something he was looking forward to, it would probably be the best option. And besides, he'd promised Nezuko he'd draw less attention to himself. Still, before he fell asleep, he wanted to get a general layout of the ferry. It wasn't an enormous boat, looked to be old-fashioned and well-worn, made of wood with no sails or motor, hence why so many sailors were needed to either pull or row the boat forward. In the center toward the back, a covered area with wooden seating had been built for passengers. The animals and heavier baggage would go on either end, he supposed. Now he just had to figure out where that weak point was. He sniffed the air, forcing himself to stay awake for a couple of minutes longer at least. He could vaguely sense the demon, but he certainly hadn't merged with the ship. Yet, it would seem he had some time at least. Still uneasy, he allowed himself to be lulled to sleep. He woke in the mountains, in the snow. He took a breath of cool, fresh air and heard the sound of laughter coming from the familiar house. He sighed and let out the breath he'd been holding. So, his dream hadn't changed. He went to step forward and looked down, catching sight of his hand. It had claws on it. His breath caught in his throat and he instantly snatched it back to his chest. Then, as he had when he'd woken up on that day, all those months ago, he turned and dashed towards the stream, practically sliding to his knees on the dock and looking over the edge. Normal. He looked completely normal. He let out a breath, practically slumping. Oni-san. He turned to see a very angry Nezuko running up to him with his winter gear in hand. He looked down at his bare feet. Oh, right, no demon healing. He reached out to take them from her but saw that his hand still had claws on it. He froze. Nezuko, he said slowly. Do I look normal? She huffed, her cheeks puffing up. Do you mean normal as in rushing out here without anything to keep you warm? Then yes, you look completely normal for someone who is about to freeze. He snorted quietly and took the hanten from her before slipping it on, following with his Fukagatsu. There, and dressed now. Good, she said, her hands on her hips. Because now we need to go train. Tanjiro blinked. Wait, what? And that quickly, the world around them had changed. No longer were they on their old mountain, but on Urokudaki's, both dressed to train. Then Nezuko turned to him. Spar with me, Oni-san. Before he could answer, she attacked him with her wooden sword, movements so graceful in the breath of water style that his own breath caught in his throat. Since when had she gotten this good? Grinning, he dodged again, parried and moved around her, getting into the fight and enjoying it. He really felt like he could go all out and was just about to pull out a Hinokami Kagura strike when movement caught the corner of his eye. Someone ran through the woods. Someone he didn't recognize. Someone who shouldn't be here. I'm your opponent, Tanjiro Nai. Nezuko said angrily, diving at him with a piercing raindrop. This is how I killed him, you know. Tanjiro's eyes widened. Muzan was dead. His heart leapt in his chest and just for a moment, everything was right with the world. But then he remembered that figure in the trees. This was just a dream. She used the fastest movement in the water style. She used it well. He still dodged out of the way and chopped her on the back of the neck. Sorry, Nezuko, he said softly as she fell to the ground, unconscious, behind him. This is truly a lovely dream. But that's all it is. And with that, he dashed into the forest after the person, using his breath style to take to the treetops. And only his breath style. He most certainly did not use any demonic traits because he's not a demon. He was not. He did not think of himself that way. He sensed something off to his left and paused, turning in that direction. There he found what looked like a rift, just hanging in the air. He only hesitated for a moment before stepping through, onto clear water with a lovely blue sky overhead. Was this his soul? Yes, that resonated with him. It felt so familiar here, so warm. The only real problem he had was the red around the horizon, fading into blue as if the sun were about to set. He didn't like that red, for some reason. Brushing it off, he dashed across the surface of the water, looking for the invader. It didn't take him long to see someone in the distance standing beside what looked to be the sun. A very small sun, surrounded by little fiery beings. Tanjiro raced towards them. The person raised their hand, as if to stab at the sun. Tanjiro felt a growl build in his chest and his claws flexed. The world around them faded further into red. He grabbed the hand just as it was about to plunge the knife into the sphere, tackling the person to the ground. The water no longer looked calm or placid as waves began to roil around them. The person, another child, just like those in his memory had been, stared fearfully up at Tanjiro. Why, you're not supposed to be here. Humans can't enter their subconscious. You'd have to be. and then their breath caught in their throat. Why you're supposed to be a D-demon SS Slayer, and not a DD demon. Tanjiro grit his teeth. Answer me truthfully, he said as calmly as he could. The sun, the heart of his own soul, felt as if it would burn him up at any second. He ignored it. Do my eyes say anything? The child. A girl, he thought but wasn't entirely sure, gulped. Why yes. His whole body tensed. What does it say? He asked. WW waxing 0. Tanjiro's heart stopped. The world hung in fragile stillness for an eternity that lasted only moments. Then he screamed. The ocean around them roiled enormous waves that didn't seem to touch them. He'd known, somehow. He'd known. Why did he have to ask? Was this part of his dream because some perverse part of him had actually enjoyed the power he'd had as a demon? Had he really fallen that far, become the monster he'd been fighting for so long? He remembered the image of a man in a white, western suit, putting a hand on his shoulder, not friendly or warm in any way, more possessive and disheartening if anything. Your ability to resist is amusing, Tanjiro-kun, he whispered in his ear. But how long can you last? Eventually you will be one of us, and you will enjoy it. No, it couldn't be. Not after everything he'd fought for. Not after. A bundle of warmth attacked him and he looked up to see the flaming beings from before pile on top of him. You're wrong, one said. He marked your soul. Another spoke without speaking. But he does not own you. Many of them practically shouted at once. Stop hurting them. One final voice that wasn't a voice pleaded, and he looked down to see the child from before screaming in pain. Tanjiro looked up at their arms, still held in his hands, and saw. Oh, had he broken them? Oh, he yelped, jumping back as if he'd been burned, then rushing forward frantically, trying to ignore the utter guilt at doing something so horrible. I'm so sorry. I don't think that should be a problem in your real body. Does it transfer? I didn't mean. I am so sorry. I'll leave, they said, cradling their hands to their chest as they scooted back away from him awkwardly. That's probably a good idea, Tanjiro said, then knelt and bowed into a seiza. But before you go, please know I did not mean to do that. I honestly and truly apologize. Silence except for some shuddering breaths from the child. I was going to kill you, you know, they said quietly. Why yet you're apologizing to me? Tanjiro looked up. I know, he said with the warmest smile he could muster. That's still no excuse. The child laughed a little hysterically. What kind of demon are you? His smile vanished for just a moment, but he forced it back. I may look like one right now, but I'm not really. That wasn't quite a lie. It wasn't quite the truth either. He didn't really know exactly what he was anymore. The child looked skeptical. Maybe you should go and I'll speak with you once your arms are feeling better. Their skepticism didn't change, but they did nod. And then they vanished. Tanjiro's shoulders slumped, and then he raised his fists high overhead and brought them down with the loudest yell he could muster. The water splashed below him. Then he looked around once again, and while the ocean still seemed a little choppy, it was better than before. The red had receded too. Good. He looked down at his hands. His clawed hands. Use them. He growled. Then he took a deep breath and let it out. Now was not the time. Somehow, he got the feeling that killing himself in this part of the world wouldn't be a good idea. So he stood and hurried back towards the forest he'd been in before. It didn't take him long to find the tear. The moment he stepped through, he drew his sword and put it to his throat. Several seconds later, he opened his eyes, gasping and startling the figure in front of him. The figure that had held a knife over him, as if to stab him. Again, he immediately grabbed the arm that held the knife and the child whimpered as if in pain. He made sure he wasn't squeezing them hard, but they still looked up at him as he rose to his full height, terrified. Why, you're really not a demon? They asked. Something inside of him clenched, but he ignored it and smiled down at the child. Nope, you're hurting me, they said softly, and from the cringe they gave, he didn't doubt it. He still didn't let go until he'd taken the knife from their hand. Once he did let go, they leapt back, cradling their arms to their chests. He isn't a kind person, Tanjiro said, finally, voice soft. What? The child asked, confused. The demon that promised you a good dream. He isn't a good person. He likes to give good dreams and then turn them into nightmares to see the look of anguish on people's faces before he eats them. Whatever dream you wanted, he would have perverted it. The child's big, brown eyes stared up at him in horror. But HEPP promised. Tanjiro reached forward slowly, putting his hand on the child's head and rubbing it gently, even after they flinched. I know, I'm sorry. They fell to their knees sobbing only barely audible over the sound of rushing water. Hey, what's your name? Tanjiro asked, kneeling down beside them. I'm Mickey. He nodded. All right, Mickey-chan. And Tanjiro, would you like to tell me what happened? She looked down, biting her lip and still sobbing quietly. I am an orphan. DD demons killed my PP papa and an younger sister. Mama was already gone. I was so hungry all the time and no one wanted me. The SS said IW was CR crazy for BB believing in demons. They threw some stones at me. Then NS saw him me and TT told me he could put me in a DD dream where they were all alive again if I just sent. She faded off. I miss them SS so much. Hey, Tanjiro said quietly, putting a hand on her head again and feeling pleased when she didn't flinch away. You know, my experience was just the opposite. After a demon encounter, I saw my family killed in front of me again and again and again. And the only way I could stop them was to become a demon myself, distract the man who turns people into demons so that they could live. He took a deep breath. I remember how much I missed them every time they died. He paused for a moment. I know it won't bring your family back, but I know of a place you could go and be safe. It won't be the same. Nothing ever can be. But you can fight against demons if you choose to, and if not, they have other ways for you to help. The girl sniffed and looked up at him as if not daring to hope. Really? She asked quietly. Really, he said, then looked around. But first we have to make sure that no one here drowns when I kill the demon. Okay. She paused, her breath hitching and shuddering before she nodded. Oh, okay. He ran his hand over her short hair again. Probably something she'd done to protect herself. Poor girl. Now, he said as he stood up, stay here until He didn't need her gasp or widening eyes to know something was behind him. He sensed the killing intent and ducked away. One of the sailors plunged a knife into the deck where he'd just been. Don't get in the way of my dream, he growled. Tanjiro didn't even hesitate to dodge the next attack, circle round and knock him out from behind, just in time to see the other men head his way. It really didn't take him long to take them out either. Stay here, he said to Mickey before running off towards the head of the boat. He paused and sniffed the air, closing his eyes to concentrate. 2 points of concentration where the scent came from. Behind him and on top of the roof of the boat, as well as just ahead towards the front of the boat. So, he'd had enough time to merge, had he? He glanced back and saw that even the animals, having some kind of sixth sense, were stamping restlessly and backing away from that side of the boat as far as they could. Tanjiro smiled, then looked up at the demon. So, you broke out of it? The waning moon asked. Let's see if you can do it again. Go to sleep. He found himself back at Urokudaki's house as Takeo, and Nezuko came running towards him. He grit his teeth and put his sword to his throat. Outside, he opened his eyes and ran towards the body on the roof. Let the demon think he'd fallen for the decoy again. He didn't realize, or care, that as he leapt up and began to engage the demon in earnest, his hat and the cloth he'd used to tie up his hair had fallen off, showing off the red of his hair glinting in the moonlight. Just as before, the waning moon panicked when Tanjiro kept coming out of his dream. He kept up his barrage against the body, not as fast or as powerful as he remembered from the train. Good. He leaped towards the demon who jumped out of his way, just as he'd hoped. Instead of following the demon into the air, he launched off of the roof towards the area the animals were steering clear of. A choked, strangled sound came from the waning moon's decoy body. Tanjiro focused on the point, knowing he'd have to immediately turn to stop the demon from trying to devour the people inside the sheltered area to recover. His feet touched the ground and he could see the strange tentacle-like growths he remembered from the train come after him. But he'd already sprung into the dance of the fire god, clear blue sky, spinning vertically in the air. The moment he did, he heard a scream, small and high-pitched, one of fear more than of pain. Turning, he saw Enmu grabbing at his throat, letting out a shriek from the entire boat. But he could also see the little girl held in one of the strange appendages by the throat. Tanjiro sprang forward, but he had a choice, the girl or the people inside. Enmu had done that on purpose. He always did make his losses hurt, but Tanjiro could do it. He used his sun breathing to shoot forward and destroy everything demon inside the pavilion, then paused at the end and turned to shoot back only to see Enmu bite down on the girl's throat. He should have taken care of the decoy body too. "No!" Tanjiro screamed and something changed. He didn't know what, but he moved faster than he had before, grabbing the side of the shelter, not noticing the claw marks he left behind, but using a first form waltz to slash through the waning moon's neck while simultaneously grabbing Mickey, landing back near the front of the boat. That was now sinking. He'd thought he had time. He'd thought he could be fast enough. He'd been wrong. Her neck was covered in blood. He didn't even know where the false body's head went and didn't particularly care at the moment. He knew this, though, there was too much blood. Too much blood. He tried to stem it, putting his hands over the puncture marks that must have gone directly into a vein or artery. "Chan," she whispered, eyes already not focusing. She was so little. "Mickey, stay with me." he begged, pleaded. It was nice, she rasped weakly. Your promise, but I get to see Papa again. No, he denied, willing the blood to stop. And Mama, Miki, and hi, za, shi, no, please, stay with me, keep talking to me. But she didn't. Her breathing slowed and then stopped altogether, and for several seconds, each lasting lifetimes, he just stood there while people inside the boat began to wake up and see they were sinking. But Tanjiro couldn't move. He could only stare at the little girl in his arms as the water of the sea washed the blood away. When had he fallen to his knees? Did it matter? He'd failed. He'd made a mistake, and she'd paid the price for it. A deep rage battered with an even deeper guilt inside him. The boat around him was still screeching weakly. The demon that had done this, the demon that needed to be eliminated. And it would be, but not fast enough. Demon blood art, he hissed to himself, not registering the words as he scratched his finger with the claw on his thumb. Palm fire explosion. A deep, red fire spread out from him, quickly encompassing the entire boat, taking the screams of both the dying demon and the people inside from worry and fading pain to intense pain and fear. Don't you think of hurting one other person? Tanjiro screamed, knowing the fire would not hurt those he did not want it to. In moments, the entire boat had gone up in a painless flame. Painless for the humans at least. The demon, on the other hand, Enmu was one of the few people Tanjiro could honestly say he hated. That didn't mean he didn't pity him. Tanjiro pitied every demon up to and including Musen himself. But few got inside his head like the waning one. Even knowing his tricks ahead of time, he'd still failed. He screamed, long and loud as he clutched a tiny form to him. Then everything that had just happened clicked in his mind and he realized what he'd done. The fire around him, the fire that even the water rushing in could not put out. His throat constricted. He shouldn't be able to do that. Why had he been able to do that? He looked down at his hands. Normal, completely normal. And yet the impossible fire raged around him, burning away the demon possession and sleeping spell alike. The impossible fire because that shouldn't be. Because he wasn't. This couldn't be. A loud horn sounded from a boat coming towards them, carrying their own light. Must have been a larger ship if they had that kind of light to throw around. Even in this darkness, for several seconds he just sort of sat there while the cries of the former waning moon finally died down, and along with it, the fire. No one approached him. He didn't blame them. The water on the deck rose, and Tanjiro couldn't help but, in his vague numb state, be a little surprised it hadn't tipped and sunk faster. Perhaps it was all the weight at the other end. The larger boat found them and began to bring people on board. Tanjiro continued to sit in the ever-growing water. Only when the other people had finally been evacuated did he stand as one man came over towards them in a boat already filled with passengers. "Young man," he asked, "can you hear me? We need to get you out." Tanjiro looked over at the fearful passengers and then down at the little girl in his arms. He nodded and began to wade towards the boat, navigating the wood that had finally begun to tip up. He even saw them helping the panicking animals onto other boats. It didn't look like a pleasant job, right? He said as he lowered himself into the water and began to swim, still holding Miki behind him. "Is she all right?" the man asked as he reached over and grabbed for Miki. "She's dead," Tanjiro said. The man faltered. "Please," the demon slayer said softly, "let me take her and give her a proper burial." He could barely see the man's eyes in the dark, but Tanjiro practically felt the man's gaze soften. "Of course," he said, helping to drag her on board. "What happened?" Tanjiro levered himself into the boat. The passengers all scooted away from him fearfully. He paused. He couldn't tell them there was a demon. They wouldn't believe him. A man wanted to sink the boat and drown the people. This girl was coerced into helping him, but I managed to talk her out of it. He saw that and killed her. The boatman's eyes widened. "What happened to him?" Tanjiro looked back at the tip of the boat as it sank beneath the waters. "I killed him." Silence. Then the boatman's gaze turned down to the sword on Tanjiro's side. "Oh," he said before yelling at the men at the oars. "Get us back to the ship." Several highs met his order and the little boat moved back to the larger one. The survivors had to remain on deck of the ship as they had little to no room for them on the lower decks. However, they would be able to reach the nearest port in less than an hour. The boatmen and the passengers all spoke with the policemen who came at the request of the captain of the ship to report the ferry sinking. They all had varying tales about waking up to see nothing and then a fire that didn't hurt or burn. How the ship had already been sinking. How the boy just sat there holding the girl in his arms. They'd been lucky another ship had been so close or there may not have been nearly as many survivors. Everyone looked for the boy for questioning. No one found them. Kagura received a report from Tanjiro stating that he'd killed Waning Moon 1. To expect the other Waning Moons to vanish and keep an eye on any they knew of. He also asked for an undisclosed amount of time for a vacation. Tanjiro never asked for a vacation or a break. That worried Kage, so he approved it with the caveat that the young demon slayer would have to keep in contact. A couple of days later, he got a simple yes from him that didn't relieve his worries. Tameo had long since found that the world worked off of exchanges. If one wanted knowledge, they had to take the time to study and learn in exchange for that knowledge. If one wanted to advance, they would have to also learn focus and use their energy in exchange for that advancement. If one wanted the power of a demon, the price for that one was too high. It had taken her years, centuries, to learn how to quietly break away from Musen's control. It had taken her almost as long to figure out how to adjust her body so that ever-persistent hunger was no longer a problem. It had taken her years to acclimate herself to being constantly around blood without the temptation. Even now, it had taken her even more years to get to a point where she had medicines that could help both demons and humans heal. And yet, she had not made much, if any, progress towards disposing of that man. She didn't like to think about that often because then she got angry, and when she got angry she started craving blood again, and human flesh, and, well, she'd been around long enough to learn how to control herself. Thankfully, which was definitely a good thing because Yushiro seemed to be somewhere between utterly panicking and screaming angry threats at the wall to their current home, the clinic practice they'd taken so long to build up. And a demon slayer stood outside of it, happily knocking on their wall and asking to be let in. A demon slayer, asking them, demons, as if he knew they were there and what they were. Had they seen Yushiro, or even her? Had they really been followed so easily? She could still read auras, and the fact that he had a large one most certainly made her nervous. She didn't fight these days. She had to save what energy she could for Musen. What should I do, Tameo-sama? Yushiro asked. I could sneak out and kill him from behind. I could make him see visions. I could let him in. Yushiro, she said quietly, finally coming to a decision. If he knew they were there, he could have easily come in already. And somehow, she had little doubt that if he wanted her dead, she would be. This both worried and intrigued her, so she figured she may as well find out what he wanted. Part of her wanted to tell Yushiro to take all of her research and escape, but she knew it would be futile. The boy was dedicated and loyal to a fault. Most of the time, she found it endearing. Every now and then, though, she found it beyond frustrating. Still, it was what it was and she couldn't very well ask more of him right now, so she left him staring after her while she went to prepare some tea. After a couple of minutes, she sensed he'd stomped outside to let the boy in. She hoped there wouldn't be a conflict. When the demon slayer walked into the sitting room with Yushiro draped over his shoulder, she wasn't sure if she should be annoyed, angry, or amused. She settled for neutral and disapproving for the moment. Why is my assistant unconscious? She asked quietly. The boy bowed to her, somehow keeping Yushiro on his shoulder, before standing and turning to walk to the couch on the other side of the room, where he very gently laid her assistant down. Forgive me, but he did try to attack me, she sighed. Did you provoke him? He sheepishly rubbed the back of his head. I may have said something about being happy to meet you, but he took it as a threat, I suppose. It's a 50-50 chance at best whether he'll attack me, and when I'm like this, I suppose it was much higher, he said with a shrug and a bright smile. Tameo frowned. What did he mean by that? Are you a Hashira? She asked, gesturing for him to come and sit at her table. Nope, he replied. You seem like you could be, she said. He brightened up. You think so? The head of the Demon Slayer Corps was hinting that he wanted me to take a position as a pillar eventually, but I don't think it's for me. Oh, she replied as she placed the tea in front of him. He didn't even hesitate or check for poison before he began sipping at it. What a strange boy. I would be grateful for the honor, but it would draw too much attention, he finally concluded. Tameo nodded in understanding. I see. Very well, then what brings you to my clinic? She finally asked, deciding to get to the point when he said nothing more on the Hashira subject. He set his cup back down and that smile returned. Well, you see, I'm from the future. She blinked at him. Excuse me. He sighed and waved one of his hands nonchalantly. I know, it's difficult to believe, but I am. He paused and seemed to think about it. Well, I've been stuck in what you call a time loop for. He faded off and frowned, looking up into his right thoughtfully. I've lost count, I suppose. Less than 100, but more than 60. I can live for anywhere from a couple of hours to 3 years each time. Sometimes I don't even live a full day before he finds me. Tameo just stared at him, her mind spinning as she tried to contemplate that. Before who finds you? She managed to ask. His smile turned decidedly bitter. Musen. She blinked again, unable to do much else. I'm sorry, I think you're going to have to explain that. He nodded. Yeah, you usually ask me to explain. Tameo paused before venturing slowly. That sounds frustrating. He shrugged. Hey, it's fine. And he proceeded to tell her about his first loop, how he'd come home to find his family dead and his sister a demon, how she hadn't eaten any human flesh, how they'd worked together to both acclimatize said little sister to daylight, and then proceed to set a trap for Muzan, how that monster managed to turn Tanjiro into a demon at the end, and how he'd eventually developed and activated a blood demon art, Ashes of History, apparently, and how he'd woken up on the day before his family was attacked, again and again and again. He recounted how he'd eventually found what he thought was the best way to keep everyone alive, divert Muzan and become a demon himself, but how in the most recent timelines, he'd tried to infiltrate the upper ranks of the 12 Kazuki by challenging Waxing Moon 3, and how Muzan must have sensed something about that because he came for Tanjiro in the next couple of resets, how Muzan had forced him into the rank of Waxing 0 because he thought Tanjiro could conquer the sun for him. He spoke of how he woke up this latest loop and had panicked and just kind of broken, according to him, how, despite poor experiences before, he'd told his mother and sister everything, and this time, they'd believed him, how they'd worked together to come up with a new plan, laid a couple of false trails and somehow, beyond all reason, it had worked, how this was the first loop since his initial loop where he had both his family alive, and was not also a demon. Once he got to that point, he paused and took a sip of the long cold tea while Tameo just stared at him. She knew it was rude, but couldn't bring herself to look away. Next to her, Yushiro looked just about as flabbergasted as she felt. He'd woken up about halfway through the Demon Slayer's explanation of his first loop and had only kept quiet due to Tameo's increasingly frustrated threats. After several seconds of silence as she thought over the implications of this boy's claimed journey, she took a deep breath. "So, why have you sought me out this time?" she asked, making sure to keep her voice steady. "If your sister is not a demon, and you are not a demon, then why do you need me?" His fists tightened around his cup and he looked hard at the table for several seconds before shifting his gaze to meet her eyes. "I would like to think that I would seek you out anyway. You are a good and wise person, despite what you think of yourself. But the truth of the matter is that the other day, I fought Waning Moon 1. Tameo's eyebrows rose. She had to admit, that was impressive if it were true, and he'd managed to walk away. His next words impressed her more. "I killed him, but..." He suddenly looked so tired. "There are few demons, even among the upper ranks of the 12 Kazuki who I actively dislike. Dauma, Jayako, Muzan himself. I find them in particular difficult to get along with. Enmu though, he just knows how to get under my skin." He shuddered. "I don't understand how people can enjoy, revel in, such cruelty." He shook his head and Tameo shot a glare at Yushiro in warning. "Let him gather himself," she wanted to say. He still seemed rather shocked, and thankfully didn't open his mouth, so she smiled at him. That seemed to break him out of his reverie and he relaxed, practically melting at her expression. She really hoped he grew out of that. "The thing is," Tanjiro went on, drawing both of their attention, "waning one's power has to do with dreams. In the first timeline, I faced him a little later on a train. When I fell asleep, I saw my family alive after they'd been killed, and I had to leave them behind to try and stop him." He grit his teeth. "I knew what to expect this time, and I knew how to get out of the dream state, so to make him think he'd captured me, I allowed myself to be put under." "That was reckless of you," Tameo said softly. Tanjiro sighed. "Yeah, I know. I thought it would be the only way to really draw him out. Maybe I was too arrogant, or maybe I'm still punishing myself." His voice grew quieter and quieter as he looked at the palm of his hand for several seconds, eventually fading into silence. Then he shook his head and the smile was back. "This child. Anyway, the thing is, in my dream everyone treated me normal, but I had claws, not." He held up his hand to show them his very plain, human fingernails. "Also, he marked me as a demon slayer and sent someone into my dreams to try and kill me. It was a little girl," and he cut off abruptly. Oh, it didn't take a genius to put the information and his pained reaction together. This would not end well. Before she could say anything, though, Tanjiro went on. "She got out of the dream and into, well, I'm not entirely sure what it was, but it felt like my soul, I suppose. The thing was, it felt off." Tameo frowned and tipped her head to one side. "Off how?" Tanjiro scratched his head distractedly, looking frustrated. "I don't know. I can't describe it, but it just felt strange. In any case, there was a ball of light there. It looked kind of like a sun and she was about to stab it, so I tackled her in. She called me a demon." He closed his eyes and clenched his hand again. "She said my eyes read Waxing 0. That was your dream, right?" Yushiro asked, a little disdainful. "So you miss being a demon?" "No," Tanjiro yelled fervently. Then he realized how rude he'd been because he backed down. "Sorry for yelling, but no, I don't miss being a demon. That's why I was confused. Why I'm still confused. I didn't take it well, and even though I didn't mean to, I was hurting the invading girl. There were these little beings. They were me, but not. His brow furrowed as his frustration towards not having the words to actually describe what he wanted grew. They told me that. He paused, took another steadying breath and met Tamayo's gaze firmly. They told me that he'd marked my soul. Do you know what they meant? I mean, I'm not a demon. He held up his very normal human hand again. And in this timeline, I really shouldn't be. So he truly had come for answers. She wasn't sure she had any, but she could make some guesses. Guesses she was sure he wouldn't like. But he earnestly sought knowledge, and so she would give it to him. I don't know what spell or power Muzan uses to mark his Kazuki, but I would suppose it goes deeper than the surface, than just the eyes. You were not marked once, but twice in 2 different lifetimes. And perhaps that has left a mark on what else is already there. Tanjiro blinked at her, looking troubled. Already there? He asked. Tamayo sighed. You are here because of your own demon blood art, correct? Slowly, carefully, he nodded. Then you are here because of a demonic power, something you initiated, that will resonate in your soul. I wouldn't have suspected it moving across time. But it isn't terribly surprising either. Demonic energy can be unpredictable. When Muzan marked you, I suspect he strengthened that resonance. As predicted, the demon slayer did not seem to like her answer. He rose to his feet and began to pace. On the boat, I got angry. I'd been able to talk Mickey down, give her something to look forward to, get her away from his influence. But he killed her, just because he could. Because he knew. He just knew it would hurt me. He didn't seem to realize his voice had risen until he found himself yelling. And something about him changed. She wasn't sure if she could really define what became so different except that the aura he gave off suddenly felt more demonic than human. And it wasn't a small amount of power he was giving off either. If he'd been remotely like this in the previous timelines, she could see why he'd made it into the upper ranks of Muzan's Kazuki. Tamayo and Yushiro exchanged wary glances, but then, the strange feeling the demon slayer gave off just stopped. Tanjiro seemed to start, then blink, and then he whirled around and bowed to them. Please forgive my rudeness. You should beg for forgiveness. Yushiro practically hissed. Hi. I'm sorry. Lower. Hi. Tamayo, for once, didn't step in as she could only stare at Tanjiro for several seconds. The strange aura from before had completely vanished, without a trace. After a few seconds, though, she smiled and waved him off. Your actions are perfectly understandable, Tanjiro-kun. She turned to her assistant. Yushiro, leave him alone. Hi, Tamayo-sama. She would not sigh again. She would not. Instead, she turned back to their guest. You were saying something about the boat. He blinked, then nodded. Right? Well, when he killed her, a little girl, just to get to me. I tried to stop him, I did. But I was too arrogant before. Other passengers were in danger too and I thought I could make it, could save all of them. But he faded off, shuddered again, and then continued to pace. I just remember holding her there and then I activated a blood art. Tamayo's eyes widened and beside her, Yushiro squawked in alarm. My family's demon arts seem to revolve around fire. Nezuko's and mine are very similar in any case. One of my most basic forms is my palm fire. It may sound underwhelming, but it's actually a surprisingly versatile power. I can throw the fire, cause it to spread or die down, control what it burns. And while the fire encompassed the entire boat in seconds, none of the passengers were burned. I only wanted to make sure that he couldn't try to kill anyone else, so I just burned the demon from the boat he'd merged with, and only the demon. I even left the wood alone despite it all sinking. The demoness raised one eyebrow a little skeptically. You didn't want to hurt him for hurting you, she asked slowly, but she'd thought this boy had been more self-aware than that. Tanjiro stopped pacing, but didn't turn to face her. I pity demons. All demons. Even Muzan. He took another breath and finally turned to look at her. The first couple of times I was turned into a demon. I don't remember more than emotions and flashes of memory. For entire loops. Later, I remembered my life as a demon, but it was like I was another person. I don't know how Nezuko did it. He sighed. She is so strong. From the sound of it, he didn't have anyone to rely on or bring him back like his sister had that first time. However, the willpower of any demon to not eat humans for any reason is commendable, and she couldn't help but agree to an extent. This Nezuko did sound insanely strong-willed. So you didn't hate him at all. Tanjiro remained silent for several seconds, but eventually he slumped a little. I'd be lying if I didn't say there wasn't something like that there. I mean, Tanjiro sighed. I didn't used to ever feel like this. Then Muzan killed my family, and even after that I could find it in me to pity the demons I came across, even before I became a demon myself the first time. Even now, I don't want to hate demons. I want to help them. How can I not, when I know what it's like? But it seems the longer I go on, the harder it gets. It's harder to not get angry, to not hate everything. There is so much darkness in the world, and Muzan may be a large part of it, but he is only a part of it. As a demon it's easier to hate. Is this the demon influence over me? Will I never be rid of it? And for all of the years he must have lived already, and she had no doubt he'd likely be approaching 100 if not more, and he was only coming to this crisis now. Tameo sighed and then smiled sadly at him. I don't think it is, Tanjiro-san, she said softly. It took him a moment to register her words, but when he did, he looked over at her in puzzlement. Not anger. This really was a pure soul. It is alright to be angry at those who consistently hurt you. I'd tell you it's alright to hate them even, but you don't seem like you want to. The boy looked down, his eyes unfocused as if he couldn't see anything. It just feels so final. Hate. It seems to hurt me as much as it hurts whatever or whoever else I hate. I don't like what it does to me. He sighed. I like being happy. I like helping other people be happy. I want to be at peace. That doesn't mean you don't get angry or hate, she said cautiously. She'd seen that attitude in children before, but this seemed different. Oh, I know that, he assured her. I'm angry at Muzan. I hate Muzan more than you may realize. His fists clenched again, and for a moment she saw a darkness in his eyes that spoke of deep pain and hurt. Pain he hadn't had time to heal from yet. Somehow that scared her more than anything else this boy had said that entire night. What did he do to you? She wondered, rather horrified herself. She'd never met someone so resilient when it came to negative influences in his life. It was subtle, but kind of awe-inspiring with context. And she suspected he didn't even know all of the context himself. I met someone once, she said slowly, thinking of a similar hair color and facial markings. Well, twice, and the second time we met we had a long conversation. During it, he described his friend to me. That friend sounded a lot like you are, Tanjiro-san. The friend said he tried to separate the act from the actor. Hate the act, not the person. I admit, I didn't understand. And I'm not entirely sure I completely agree even now, but I can see where he is coming from. If you don't want to hate the person, then don't. Try to understand where the person came from, their background, their reasoning, even if you don't agree. However, she paused and smiled kindly at the boy in front of her who seemed to hang off every single word. You can hate the act they made, the choices they made, the circumstances that put them there. It sounds like that's what you do for demons now anyway. Perhaps just be a little more conscious about it so you don't feel guilty about those few who have no reason to hurt but still do, those few who know their actions and how they affect others and still choose to act deplorably because they want that reaction. She remembered the man offering her relief from her illness only to turn her into a monster and let her rampage and destroy the home she had loved so much. And he'd enjoyed it. He'd wanted to break her, simply because he could. Tameo-sama. Yushiro's voice brought her out of her memory and she glanced over at him, then over at Tanjiro who looked to be thinking very hard. I'm fine, Yushiro, she said softly. Thank you. He merely nodded, then ventured quietly, you don't often talk that much. She chuckled a little at that. It isn't often needed. He frowned, and then turned a jealous glare on Tanjiro. Tameo let herself sigh this time. Then, suddenly, Tanjiro looked up, beaming. Thank you, Tameo-san. I knew coming here was a good decision. She blinked, then smiled warmly back. He looked far more at ease than he had just minutes ago. Yushiro slapped his hand on the table. Tameo felt a headache begin to build behind her eyes. That's Tameo-sama to you. Tanjiro blinked at him, then turned that innocent, purely inquisitive look on her. Is that what you would like me to call you, Tameo-san? She shot a glare at Yushiro. Tameo-san is fine, she said, emphasizing the last word while looking pointedly at her assistant. But Tameo-sama, Yushiro, she cut in crossly. He immediately snapped to attention, back straight. Yes, Tameo-sama. Withholding another sigh, she turned back to Tanjiro, who seemed to be watching them with amusement. Oh, that meant his innocent question hadn't been quite so innocent. This child was more devious than he let on. Tanjiro-san, she ventured, voicing her potential question slowly. Would you mind if I could study your blood? I'd like to know what actually is going on, and you mentioned a cure for demons. I'd like to try and attempt that this time as well. The boy just grinned wider. Sure, if you want I can stick around for a couple of days. Rest, help out. We don't need your help. Yushiro practically yelled. Yushiro, you will stop that immediately. Yes, Tameo-sama. Their visitor was watching Yushiro wryly, but didn't seem offended. Thank goodness. Tameo cleared her throat. We can definitely set up a room for a couple of days. Thank you so much for your hospitality, Tanjiro said, bowing low. Yushiro, please go prepare a room. Oh, if it could be the one next to you that would be fine, Tanjiro said after him, smile big and innocent. Oh, he was definitely more devious than he let on. Either that or the most pure thing Japan has ever seen. Or, somehow, potentially both. Oh, she would pay dearly to see this boy confront Muzan. Tanjiro stared at Tamayo-san's neutral face as her words sank in. The more you use that power, the more you will revert to being a demon. His breath caught in his throat and he looked down at his hand again. It still looked human. But for how long? Really, he should have expected something like this. But it still hurt. He'd enjoyed being human again. He liked being able to eat rice and seaweed and fruit. He loved that he could walk under the sunlight without repercussions, not having Muzan looking over his shoulder every single second. Fabulous. But it seemed now that this reprieve wouldn't last. Really, he should have known. He'd come to Tamayo-san knowing that something was off. He'd helped her with her work on analyzing his blood in both his human and demonic state. It hadn't been easy, but he'd managed to get himself to transform to give samples by thinking about the fight with Enmu and trying to imagine himself back on the boat, slipping into that state like he had worried him. Not because he couldn't control it, but because he was worried that Muzan would gain a connection to him again. Despite him not seeming to be subject to the curse, he'd brought the worry up to Tamayo-san and they'd tested it carefully. It turned out that he could still say Muzan's full name when transformed, but the longer he remained in his demonic state, the more the feeling he shouldn't continue grew, eventually reaching a point where he simply didn't dare. Once he dropped out of the state again, the feeling had vanished. No one had any illusions as to what that meant. He couldn't let Muzan get any memories of his previous lives. That was what had led to his most recent loop. He couldn't handle another one like that. People called him resilient when he continued to care about the beings who had hurt him and his family so badly. But everyone had their breaking point. He knew what his would be. Muzan somehow finding his family and forcing him into servitude again. The very idea almost sent him into what Tamayo-san called a panic attack. They were aptly named. It was a sort of quiet panic instead of Zenitsu's loud shrieks or Inosuke's angry screams. The kind that built in his chest and stopped him from being able to breathe or care or think. That state of mind, more than anything else, scared him, to be honest. Demon or not, he wasn't sure he could control himself with that kind of panic eating at him. Tamayo-san had told him that if he happened to have such a panic attack during a fight, that he needed to slow down and count his breathing. He told her he shouldn't have a problem with that because if he was in a fight, he'd certainly be using total concentration breathing. He tried to do so constantly anyway, so she told him that feeling someone else breathe slowly can help as well and that he needed to concentrate on what he could sense in the moment. The one time he'd had to use the information, she'd walked him through it, talking about what he could feel and taste and see and smell. It had helped. A lot. Fortunately, he didn't need to use it now, but it was a near thing. Taking a deep breath and then returning to the total concentration breathing, he looked up at Tamayo-san. I thought you said the blood you took when I was human looked perfectly normal. He tried not to sound accusing, but he needed to understand. Yushiro looked about ready to tackle him for simply asking the question. Tamayo-san sighed, then nodded, interrupting whatever Yushiro had been about to say. It does, for the most part. However, after some studying, I did find some demonic cells. Tanjiro blinked, mind barely processing that. How? He finally asked. From studying with her in previous loops, he knew that demons had blood similar to a human's, but their cells were fundamentally different. Muzan's cells acted very much like a virus, invading the cells of the human and changing them. It was how the cells changed that tended to give demons their blood arts, and Muzan's cells interacted differently with each host. Tamayo-san had always commented that it was an interesting, if horrible, process to observe. However, a balance between the human and demon cells had to remain as the demon cells couldn't seem to function on their own. At least, not initially. Eventually, once they, too, adapted to their hosts, they could act as cells the body needed, regenerating quickly and efficiently, thus halting aging and encouraging regrowth. That initial struggle for balance was why some humans couldn't handle Muzan injecting his blood or injecting too much blood into them. It was also why demons woke up so hungry. The demonic cells wanted more human cells to devour and invade. Demonic cells existing next to human cells without one attacking the other shouldn't be possible. When Tamayo-san remained silent, seemingly lost in her own thoughts for a moment, Tanjiro pressed. How can I have demon cells inside of me that aren't attacking the rest of me? Isn't that what demon cells do? And how can I have demon cells inside of me at all? I haven't even come in contact with Muzan or any of his waxing moons. Tamayo-san just shook her head, having come out of her thoughts at his question. I don't know, Tanjiro-san, she said quietly. In all my years, I have never seen anything like this before. The demonic cells in your blood as a human seem to have already mutated to fit your body, however. They aren't attacking any of your normal cells when you are human. It took me a while to find them at all, but once I knew what to look for, I did indeed find them in small amounts. They seemed stagnant, dormant even, and in such a state would have little to no effect on your body. She paused for a moment, taking a sip of her tea. Tanjiro just continued to wait, hands in fists as he tried not to worry. That was what I learned from your first human sample, she finally continued, expression still neutral. However, in your demonic state, the cells multiplied tenfold at least. At that point, they did attack some of your human cells, although not at the rate I would have expected. The sample taken after you reverted back to your normal human state looked much like the first sample. I don't know where the extra demon cells vanished to. I don't know if they merged or simply disappeared altogether. However, while it wasn't an enormous increase, there were more of them from that second human sample. The only conclusion I can come to is that the more you use that power, the more you will slowly transform. Eventually, it will reach a point where even reverting back to a normal state won't erase enough demonic cells. When they reach a point where they permanently outnumber your human cells, you will have become a demon again. As for an explanation, I can theorize you are somehow, subconsciously, tapping into your demon blood art and reaching back through time to your other lives for the extra strength your body feels you need to finish a battle. But it is just a theory. In Tanjiro's experience, her theories tended to be pretty close to truth. He grit his teeth. I became complacent, he finally said, relying so much on demonic strength that my body doesn't know how to fight without it anymore. He felt sick and angry, sick at the fact that he hadn't escaped the curse after all, that Musen's mark on his soul had somehow continued on through time and brought his cursed cells with it. Angry at himself, his subconscious, for allowing it and relying on it to a point where he couldn't even be completely human when he went back in time. I still think, Tameo-san said slowly, drawing him from his spiraling thoughts, that you will be our best chance at fighting him. And I still think that the information I have gained from your blood can help me develop a cure, or at least a stopgap measure. Tanjiro looked up at her, unable to keep the hope he felt at her words from showing on his face. For the first time since the conversation began, she smiled at him, soft and small. I don't know how long it will take, but I will most definitely work on it as often as I can. Be grateful Tameo-sama is using her precious time for you, Yushiro said, apparently unable to keep his frustration back anymore. Tanjiro realized she may have a more difficult time developing a cure simply because his circumstances were so unusual, and once again he felt immensely grateful he'd met her in his first life. Hi, he said, hoping that she understood how grateful he was. Just in case she didn't, he bowed his head deeply. Thank you for your help, Tameo-san. I cannot express the depth of my gratitude. Yushiro snorted lightly, seemingly appeased, and Tanjiro looked up warily. He'd returned to kneeling calmly, tea in hand. Tameo-san looked fondly annoyed at him, and Tanjiro found himself grinning a little. Their relationship rarely changed, and it was a constant he could definitely appreciate. In any case, she said, turning back to her guest. Tanjiro sat up straight, listening intently. I must reiterate this, Tanjiro-san. You need to realize that you can only use that power in the most dire of circumstances. The more demon cells in your body, the more demon-like tendencies you'll have, even as a human. If you use that form too often, you will risk falling to Musen again. He didn't really need that reiterated, but she wasn't wrong. He nodded firmly at her. Hi, Tameo-san. I'll remember that. Of course, unless he came across one of the waxing moons or a particularly large group of demons. He doubted he'd have to resort to that. She sent another smile at him, and Tanjiro ignored the jealous glare Yushiro sent him. In any case, since you do have demonic cells in you, I'd recommend you take the rest of the time you have here to sleep. Your demonic cells have already adapted to your body, but with some of the side effects we've witnessed, they may need time to change as they have in the past reiterations you've spoken of. Tanjiro blinked. He hadn't thought of that. Well, he did have an undisclosed amount of time off from his demon slayer duties. How much time could he spend here? Would it help at all? Although, I do have one more request of you. Tameo-san ventured carefully. Tanjiro blinked, then looked up and thought back over their conversation. Then he smiled at her. You want me to gather blood from the 12 Kazuki to help you with your research because they have the most amount of Musen's blood. How dare you presume to know Tameo-sama's mind? Yushiro shouted. Tanjiro ignored him, grinning at his hostess instead. She blinked, then smiled again. Exactly. Yushiro's head whipped around, looking betrayed. The time traveler put a hand up to the back of his head, rubbing it thoughtfully. I don't know how long I can stay, but let me write to Yubaeshiki-sama and tell him about some of the waning moons I know about. He can set up a time for multiple demon slayers to strike. I'll rest here until I have to leave for that. If that is all right with you, of course. The green-haired boy had opened his mouth to say something, but closed it with an angry snap when Tanjiro bowed to Tameo-san again. That seems more than acceptable in trade for the information you have brought to me, she said softly. Did you bring your Kasugai crow with you? Tanjiro nodded. I did. I just need some paper, a brush and an inkstone to write to Yubayashiki-sama. If we go now, we may be able to get to some of them before Muzan kills them all off. Of course, Tamayo-san said with a nod of her head. Yushiro, she turned to the boy by her side. Please go and get some writing supplies. He glared once more at Tanjiro before turning to Tamayo-san, practically sparkling. Hi, Tamayo-sama. Tamayo-san didn't sigh, but that fondly exasperated expression had returned. Tanjiro just grinned. An hour later, he walked outside of Tamayo-san's house and whistled. Immediately, his crow came to him and he handed the letter to him. When you bring a reply, come back here and just head straight over the fence, he instructed, pointing to the supposedly unbroken fence behind him. You'll find a large building on the other side with some demons inside. They won't hurt you, I give you my word. I've updated Yubayashiki-sama on several things, so it is extremely important that he gets this as soon as possible. Understand? Yes, the crow said. Tanjiro smiled. Great, I'll await your return. Fly safely, he said and rose into the air. Tanjiro watched him go before he returned inside where Tamayo-san had asked Yushiro to prepare some food for their guest. He thanked the boy and choked the overcooked rice and fish down without complaint. Yushiro just sort of sulked at him, watching while Tanjiro cleaned his dishes and then asked Yushiro to inform Tamayo-san he would be retiring for an unknown amount of time. He hadn't tried to sleep longer than one night this time, and while part of him hoped he could, part of him hoped it would all prove to be unnecessary. Still, better safe than sorry. Once in his room, he went through his nightly routine, wrote a letter to Nezuko and his family that he would ask his crow to take once he returned, before laying down on the futon and eventually drifting off. Tanjiro woke 4 days later. That both worried and relieved him. Worried him because it was necessary, relieved him because it meant his body still could change if he ended up becoming a demon again. He'd still prefer that didn't happen, but he'd long ago decided that if that was what he had to do to keep his family safe, then he would. He also didn't feel any different and didn't know what to make of that. Usually he could feel something had changed when he woke up, but it had only been 4 days. And was he hungry? He hadn't eaten at all in that time. Yushiro had woken him by rudely shaking him and thrust a letter from Yubayashiki-sama at him. Your crow wouldn't stop making noise. Tell it to be somewhat respectful next time. Tanjiro just grinned. He'd admitted that there would be a next time. Hi, he replied. Yushiro just scowled and stomped out of the room, leaving Tanjiro to open his letter. First, it thanked him for his information and then let him know that he had put together a group of demon slayers to send against Mount Natagumo. Then it asked him to go along, of course, to meet a pillar and a demon slayer ranked Kino at the end of the week. They would be leading the contingents of demon slayers against Rui's nest of Tsuchigumo. It would take him about that long to make it to the rendezvous point if he didn't want to rush, which meant he'd have to leave as soon as possible. Also, apparently for defeating Waning One, he'd been promoted to Kino as well. He didn't even remember what rank he'd reached his first life, as it hadn't really mattered. He just tried to be as strong as he could, and that was that. Still, he appreciated the appointment and thanked Yubayashiki-sama in his confirmation letter before sending that in his letters to his family with his Kasugai crow. Tanjiro smiled as he set off that morning, bidding Tamayo-san and Yushiro farewell. Tamayo-san wished him well. Yushiro told him good riddance, but he'd better come back alive for Tamayo-san's research, and to watch out for their cat. Tanjiro smiled, knowing that was the boy's way of wishing him well too. It was nice to know that human or demon, he could count on these two as allies. It was a good feeling. He stopped on the way out of town at a restaurant and ate far more than he normally would have, but figured that 4 days of sleeping for a human, even if he did have demon cells inside of him, was pushing it. He also picked up some rice balls for the road. Not a half hour on his way, his stomach growled and he picked out a rice ball to snack on. By the time noon rolled around, he'd eaten all of them already. I sure have eaten a lot today, he said to himself. I wonder why I'm so hungry. The more demon cells in your body, the more demon-like tendencies you'll have, even as a human. He stopped on the road, hand on his growling stomach. For several seconds he just stood there, but eventually he shook his head. No, it's just because I slept too long. That's all. He'd pick up some extra food when he reached the next town. If he hurried, he could get there in time for a long dinner. He had enough money. He'd just gotten paid. Besides, Kanroji-san ate a lot too, didn't she? And she was fully human, right? He didn't even remember how much he'd eaten at meals the first time, so maybe it was pretty normal for someone learning a breath style. Rengoku-san had eaten a lot of food too. Yeah, that was it. He took off his conical hat as he pushed on, happy to feel the sun on his head not burning him to death, determined to get to the next town and eat hot pot until he bursts. I don't care, Rui said in his monotone voice. Now get off my mountain. Silence for just a few seconds and then a cacophony of noise. What do you mean? You don't care? You think you can just barge in here? How can you say that? And just demand. Do you want to die? You immature brat. Don't talk to Rui-sama like that. Leave now. Quiet, Rokuro shouted, having activated his blood art two tails to make sure they understood the threat in his voice. Thankfully, everyone listened to him. Probably a good thing for them. He was running out of patience and he outranked everyone there. Slowly, he allowed himself to shrink back down and his facial markings to fade back to the normal vein-like pattern that had stuck around since he'd gained his position as Waning Moon 2. He breathed out, his mind coming back to him, and he eyed every one of the 24 or so demons before him, trying not to show his disgust. This was why demons weren't supposed to form groups. They just didn't work well together, except when they had to, apparently, or when Lord Muzan required it. And of course that lousy Enmu had gone and gotten himself killed, leaving Rokuro to pick up the pieces. Still, the expression of fear from most of the demons and wariness from the rest of the Waning Moons made him want to smile. He wasn't used to being in charge of a group, but that didn't mean he couldn't enjoy it instead of being the one on the bottom. He would make sure they would win this battle, even if he had to drag them kicking and screaming to victory. Rokuro remembered the recent meeting with Lord Muzan, remembered suddenly finding himself in the tunnels underneath the town he preferred to haunt afterwards, hand reaching for his still intact neck as he breathed hard. He remembered realizing that he could have done absolutely nothing if the demon progenitor had decided they were too weak and worthless. He'd only just made it into the Waning Moons and he'd thought it such an accomplishment. But now he realized, as he always had, that it wasn't enough. It would never be enough until he held the top position and no one could hold anything over him ever again. He hadn't expected to leave that meeting alive. He hadn't been the only one either. In all honesty, Rokuro hadn't been sad to see Enmu go, but instead of promoting them all a number, Lord Muzan had told them that he'd give them one final chance to catch the demon slayer boy with the red eyes and hair. If they succeeded, not only would they live, but he'd also give anyone surviving more of his blood. Then he'd strongly recommended they work together and given them a month to accomplish the task. Rokuro had known from the get-go that it wouldn't be easy to herd the Waning Moons into something remotely cohesive, let alone find the blasted demon slayer to begin with. Their normal methods of finding a place and picking off their meals as they wandered or were lured into traps wouldn't work. They'd had to be active, so Rokuro had hunted down each and every one of the Waning Moons and they'd been reluctant but desperate enough to join forces and share information. They'd all started to get antsy when 2 weeks had gone by without a single lead. But then Mugako, Waning 4, had overheard a conversation between a group of demon slayers leaving her town and managed to pick up on their new assignment, an assault on Mount Natagumo. Apparently, many demon slayers were being called off their current missions for said assault, and she'd even managed to get the date. It would be their last best chance at finding the red-haired boy and a great opportunity to take out a bunch of demon slayers while they were at it. So she'd come to Rokuro, who had picked up a surly Wakiraba and the skittish new Waning 6, Kaminu before heading to Rui's mountain. And now he wanted them to leave. What utter ridiculousness. On one side of the room, Rui and his family stood, looking about ready to attack or run, and on the other side stood the other 4 Waning Moons. This was so not his day. Why didn't people just listen to him? He took a deep breath and tried to keep calm. Rui, he said slowly, you realize that several demon slayers and likely even Hashira are coming to your mountain. They will kill you all. Uneasy shifting from the rest of the Tsuchigumo, but the youngest looking of them stood his ground utterly calm, almost bored. This mountain is mine and my family's. It is ours to protect. We don't want you here. Behind him, Mugako grit her teeth and let out a TCH sound. He saw Wakiraba roll his eyes out of the corner of his vision and Kaminu shifted uneasily, hands full of paper dolls. He pinched the bridge of his nose, refusing to let this all devolve into a fight. You don't understand, Rui, he finally said, tone hard as steel. We're not asking to stay. We will stay. Period. They got a reaction out of the boy. He grit his own teeth and stepped forward angrily. Don't get involved in family matters. Rokuro laughed aloud at that. Oh, this was almost cute, him thinking he could take Waning 2 with his band of misfit spider demons. Family. Yeah, sure, whatever, kid, he said, still chuckling. But I can't say that I care. The only thing I care about is fulfilling Lord Muzan's wishes and not dying, something you don't seem to care about. More shuffling from the spider demons, but he didn't even bother to tense up. If they attacked him, they'd die. End of story. I will fulfill the request on my own. With my family, the white-haired kid insisted. Mugako laughed this time. Right, because your entire family can potentially stand up to the person who killed Waning Moon 1. She nudged Rokura in the side. He had to remind himself that he really shouldn't kill her too. He's so funny. I wonder if he does parties. Don't talk about Rui-sama like that. One of the spider demons, a petite woman with an ample chest and long, white hair, stepped forward. Mother, Rui said softly, his voice quiet. The woman eeped and stepped back, looking chastised. This is a waste of time, Wakiraba said, rolling his head and popping several joints in his neck. If the kid wants to die, fine. Let him. We can ambush the Slayer Corps scum on the way out. Several people spoke up at that, from both sides, but Rokura thought about the suggestion. That wasn't a bad idea. Just needed a little tweaking here and there. Yes, that could work. Fine, he finally said loudly over the din. Once again, everyone stopped, leaving the quiet for him to fill. He could definitely get used to that. Maybe Rui had the right of it after all by getting himself a bunch of subordinates. He'd have to think on that later, when he earned more of Lord Musen's blood. For now, he had demons to corral. You and your demons take this side of the mountain. We won't interfere unless we see the red-haired, red-eyed kid. You act as a distraction for everyone else coming. We'll capture him and take him to Musen. Everyone's involved. Everyone gets the reward. Everyone's happy. What do you say, brat? Rokura raised an eyebrow, daring him to refuse. This was him being nice. Finally, Rui stood straight and nodded. Acceptable. Rokura nodded once and turned to walk out. We'll find a suitable place to watch. Good luck with the core, brat. And with that, he led the other waning moons out of the decrepit house. They didn't have a lot of time before sunrise and would have to find a decent place to hole up. He thought he'd spotted some caves a couple of miles north, on the other side of the mountain. Didn't expect you to give in like that, Wakaruba said once they'd gotten far enough from house that no one would be listening in. Rokura snorted. If you think that was me giving in, then no wonder you haven't beat me. The waning three glared angrily, but before he could say anything, his superior went on. The brat wants to face the core alone. Fine, betting there will be a pillar or some of the higher ranked ones in there. Let his family distract all of them while we keep an eye out for Lord Musen's prize. He paused. Remember, he wants the kid alive. But why? Nezuko whined. You wouldn't want him anyway, Wakaruba said. He's a demon slayer, so he doesn't work for the government. Rokura noticed the very quiet Kaminu's expression darken. Right, the brat actually liked the current government. The waning two didn't really see a point either way. A human was a human. Admittedly, he himself tended to like going after higher class people, so he probably couldn't talk. Still, at least he preferred cattle who were well fed, not worked to the bone. He didn't really know what kind of human Kaminu preferred. Not that he particularly cared. I don't mind a demon slayer either, Mugako said back, eyes dreamy. I'll bet he'll taste so good. No, he won't, Kaminu finally cut in harshly. Didn't you hear a word Rokura-san and Musen-sama said? She snorted. Of course I did. 6, she returned disdainfully. I can control myself. Unlike some people. He snarled at her. Like you know anything about me. She just giggled cruelly. I've seen you around your preferred age. What is it? 40, 50, men or women? You tear them apart. Like you're any better, Shogun supporter. You say that like I support any government, she replied cheekily. The brat looked ready to attack her at any moment. We need to pick up the pace if we want to make it to a cave by sunrise, Rokura cut in, wanting to keep everyone on track. Besides, who cares how the humans govern themselves as long as we're loyal to Lord Musen? But I do so love a man in uniform, Mugako replied sweetly, licking her lips hungrily. Kaminu threw several paper dolls at her, but before they could even get halfway, Rokura stopped them by cutting them down and halting their momentum. That's enough. We are here for one purpose and one purpose only. If you can't even get along now, how do you expect to fight without getting in each other's way? So you will shut up before I have to kill one of you to shut you both up. Understand? Behind them he could see Wakiraba snickering quietly. 4 and 6 eyed each other before Mugako turned away and shrugged. Fine, whatever, she said as she walked away. Kaminu just harumphed and went back to sulking and playing with his dolls, watching the little things flutter around him in an impressive dance. Honestly, they were worse than children. This would be a long few days. Jiu wasn't quite sure what to think of the new kids. The sheer exuberance coming from either one of them alone, let alone together, baffled him. Mitsuri Kenroji had arrived first in the most revealing Demon Slayer uniform he'd ever seen. Why would anyone fight in something like that? She had almost no protection. And did she dye her hair like that or was it natural? Could a hair color like that be natural? He decided not to comment on it. It really wasn't his place and with his half and half Haori, He didn't really have any room to judge now that he thought about it. She tended to be loud and forward and innocent but hungry all the time. And if he didn't see the way she unconsciously walked, ready to move at a moment's notice, he'd wonder if she was really the Kino bordering on Hashira that Oyakata-sama had spoken of. Just being around her made Jiu want to curl up and go to sleep. She was exhausting, but also kind of endearing. And if she could prove her skill, he wouldn't say anything. He could respect skill. Then they met Kamado Tanjiro the day before the attack would take place. Yet another person with an unusual hair color and eye color who came running up to them with the largest smile imaginable on a red face. He wore a green and black checkered haori and held a straw hat in his hand. It may not have been so bad if Kamado hadn't also been 14. To his knowledge, the record for the youngest pillar was Kacho Shinobu, who had become a Hashira at 16, 2 years after her sister's death. Jiu himself had been 17. Kenroji was currently 18, a respectable age to become a pillar, but this 14-year-old child, and his eyes, they didn't look like the eyes of someone who had killed enough demons to reach Kino. They were just kind. He'd never seen eyes like that before. It probably didn't help that the boy looked at Jiu like he hung the stars. It made him uncomfortable. Why would anyone look up to him? No one should look up to him, especially some brat who didn't even know him. And worse, while Kenroji had been happy to just keep talking about many things from the mission to the taste of her food to the weather, Kamado kept asking Jiu everything. Asked him about his opinion, about himself in general, about his experiences. He didn't know what it was, but he didn't think he liked it. It left him wondering why, exactly, Oyakata-sama thought Jiu would be the best choice to lead this battle. Or maybe he hadn't had a choice. That was, actually very likely. Jiu made sure to let them know that he would prefer to discuss the upcoming mission, and otherwise didn't answer any questions directed at him. While Kamado seemed a little disappointed at that, he didn't have any problems getting along with Kenroji, and the two of them seemed to feed off of each other in a terrifying loop of excitement and enthusiasm, despite Jiu's attempts to curb it. Surprisingly, though, when he brought their conversations and tangents back on track, they both had a lot of good ideas and information about the upcoming battle. Kenroji, it seemed, tended to work well in groups, as she'd done so often before. Kamado had a nose for intelligence as he had the most information on the demons they'd be attacking. He described a group of demons led by the Waning Moon 5, and that none of them are to be underestimated. He said that the demons had all taken on roles of a family, supposedly protecting their youngest brother. But that youngest brother also happened to be the Waning Moon and the one in charge. They could expect many demons on the mountain, but only the ones who looked like the Waning Moon, extremely pale, white hair, spider-like attributes or powers, were part of the family. He didn't expect other demons to be on the mountain, but one could never be sure. They decided that they would each approach the mountain with their own group of demon slayers several kilometers apart, entering the forest covering the mountain at different points so as to create a larger net and allow fewer demons to escape. Kamado did warn them that there was a spider demon who could control people like puppets with spider silk, and if someone began to act strangely, to use their breath style to cut the air around the person to stop that from happening. The spider demon could do that to corpses as well as they could to living humans. They would all need to be on their guard. Again, Jiu found himself impressed with the sheer amount of intelligence information the boy had and shared. The other demon slayers had met up at different locations so as to not draw attention, and they would all go to the mountain that evening. So it would only be the three of them until they met up with other factions where they were supposed to gather at the base of the mountain. Once they had a working plan, signals set up to call for help and secret phrases, so demons couldn't infiltrate them as easily, Kamado suggested they get a room and an inn to sleep for the rest of the day. Since they'd discussed most of their plans at lunch, the other demon slayers agreed and headed to the local inn Jiu had been staying at. Once they were all settled, they each fell asleep quickly. Jiu was only too thankful for the quiet. Nahisa Imagawa shifted nervously in place where he stood on the side of the road next to a rice paddy. He'd met up with a large group of fellow demon slayers at the base of Mount Natagumo as instructed and now could do nothing but watch the sun go down. Beside him, his fellow slayer who had passed the test with him, Sawe Mieb, shot him a reassuring smile. He appreciated it. They'd teamed up at the final selection, one of them keeping watch while the other slept, and when a mission required 2 or more people, it often ended up being the 2 of them working together. Having her there helped a lot. He often felt bad for having to rely on her so much, but he also realized that of the 2 of them, she was definitely the sturdier, more powerful one. With a larger frame than most women he knew and straight black hair cut to frame her face in a more modern, Western style. He knew she often got flack for not being a more ideal female. But honestly, he wouldn't want his friend to be any other way. Her body type and determination allowed her to use the stone-breathing style and kept her alive. How could he not be thankful for that? Just watching her charge into fights so confidently gave him the courage to do so himself despite his different breath style. His win to her rock, and as neither one of them could perform all of the techniques of their individual styles, he liked to think they made up for each other's weaknesses. However, this was larger than any group they'd been a part of before. Apparently, Mount Natagumo was a veritable nest of demons, but unfortunately their Kasugai crows didn't have any more information to share. So now they could really only wait for the Hashira and Kino level demon slayers to show up so they could get this raid started. Imagawa both wanted to hurry up and get this over with while he simultaneously wanted to run in the opposite direction. He'd never had to deal with more than 2 demons at once before, and that was with Mie by his side. He hated this anticipation and wished the Hashira would just come already. He didn't know how long he waited there on the side of the road next to his friend while more and more demon slayers arrived. There had to be at least 2 dozen or so by now, but none of them had stepped up claiming to be a Hashira. Then someone across from him, who had taken a seat, stood up quickly, looking down the road. Imagawa followed their gaze to see 3 more figures approaching. The one leading looked calm and collected, despite the left and right sides of his haori mismatching. The 2 behind him, both shorter, although one in particular, seemed to be caught up in an enthusiastic discussion of some kind. Tomioka-sama, the person who stood, said, then bowed at the waist. Thank you for coming to lead us in this. The man's steps slowed, but his expression didn't change. I am following orders, he replied. Still, the man next to Imagawa said, from one water breath user to another, I am glad you were the Hashira chosen. Perhaps it was the darkness of the fading daylight, but Imagawa could have sworn he saw confusion cross the newcomer's face. Water pillar, huh? He'd heard about the water pillar being a young man about Imagawa's age who tended to come off as stoic. It seemed he hadn't misheard. Behind the pillar, the 2 demon slayers he'd been traveling with had stopped speaking and seemed to watch the interaction in front of them with various expressions. One of utter happiness from the girl, while the shorter one, a boy of maybe 13 years, had a warm, approving smile on his lips. The apparent Hashira didn't actually answer the man, instead getting directly to the point. All demon slayers over here, he called out, then waited for a moment while the corp members meandered over and formed around him in a half circle. I am the water Hashira Tomioka Jiyu. I will now inform you of what we have decided for the attack on the demon nest on Mount Natagumo. You will be split into 3 groups. One group will follow me, one will follow Kino Kenroji Mitsuri, and the third will follow Kino Kamado Tenjiro. Kenroji-san's group will go to the left, mine to the right. The demons in this area have been identified as Tsuchigumo. Next to him, Miebe sighed as Imagawa shuddered. He hated spiders. The leader of your group will discuss more about the individual demons you may come across. We do expect to come across Waning Moon 5 here, at least. Imagawa could swear his heart stopped. No wonder they needed a Hashira and 2 Kino, one of the 12 Kazuki. Here, he is a smaller demon and will likely look younger than the rest of them. Do not let this fool you. He is incredibly strong and any one of Musen's Kazuki will be ruthless. Now, split into 3 groups. Don't forget to introduce yourselves. The girl who had been with the man spoke up. Your comrades need to know your fighting style and rank and everything. Also, what was she wearing? It was hard for him to take his eyes off of her assets, and only managed when Miebe elbowed him in the ribs. Maybe we shouldn't go with that group, she said, sounding amused. Too distracting for some of us. Imagawa could only nod his head, blushing. Why would anyone wear so little? It took them a couple of minutes to split themselves into semi-equal groups, but once they did, they all began to talk among themselves. The group that Imagawa and Miebe ended up in would be led by the 3rd Kino. Well, Miebe said firmly once their group had gathered. I'll start. My name is Sawem Miebe. Rank, Hino, and I can perform 3 of the 5 stone breathing techniques. She stopped, then looked deliberately at Imagawa. He swallowed, but forced himself to step forward and bow. Nehisa Imagawa, he said, probably too loudly but couldn't seem to control his voice. Then he stood, hoping he looked more confident than he felt. Pleased to meet you. My rank is Hinoto and I can perform 6 of the 9 forms in the wind breathing style. And so it went around until it got to the kid that Tomioka-san had come with. My name is Kamado Tenjiro, rank Kino. I know 10 of the 11 water-breathing techniques and 13 out of 13 of the sun-breathing techniques. I hope we work well together. Silence met his words. Then one of the men, Imagawa didn't remember his name but did remember that he claimed to be able to perform 3 of the 6 thunder-breathing techniques, stepped forward. You claim to be our leader? He asked, incredulous. Kamado looked surprised. Then he smiled a huge smile that did not look remotely menacing and spoke. "Yes, pleased to meet you, Teruano-san. You're like 12, one of the others said in a similar tone to Teruano. 14, actually, Kamado returned, still smiling that huge smile. We're supposed to be led into this by a 14-year-old. Teruano asked, beginning to sound angry. Kamado blinked. Well, yes, those were my instructions from Yubayashiki-sama. Are you really a Kino? Someone else from the group sounded just as skeptical as Imagawa felt. The boy nodded, said his password and held up his hand as the mark that appeared indeed showed the word Kino. How do you know 2 breathing styles? Another person asked. He looked them dead in the eye and said, I trained until I almost died. Before anyone else could say anything, Miebe stepped forward. I think we should focus on the mission, she said, glaring at Teruano. We are all here under orders, and our current ones are to follow Kino Kamado Tanjiro. The boy practically beamed up at her. Thank you, Sawame-san. Then, while his smile didn't fade, his countenance changed somehow. He looked at each of them, completely serious as he spoke. Let me tell you about the demons we may encounter in the forest. He then went on to describe demons with full-on spider bodies that could turn anyone into whom he or his minions injected poison. Into said minions. Spiders with human heads. He spoke of a demon who could attach spider silk to arms and legs of anyone and play them like puppets against their comrades. He spoke of demons who trapped people in acidic balls of silk and waited for the humans to literally digest before she drank what was left. Of giants with spider-like faces, of other ones he wasn't even sure of. And none of those were even the waning moon. At this point, the only thing really keeping Imagawa there was the fact that Miebe would go with or without him. But his knees felt weak and his stomach had dropped to somewhere around his pelvis, and the only thing keeping him upright at the moment was his total concentration breathing. There are many strong demons on this mountain, Kamado concluded. But if we stick together and watch each other's backs, there is every reason for all of us to come out of this alive. That sounded a little optimistic right now, but Imagawa found himself clinging almost desperately to those words. Now, Jiu-san and Mitsuri-san have taken their groups already, he said, looking over his shoulder at the now empty road. And he was on first-name basis with a pillar and another Kino. This kid, so we need to get going soon. Everyone pick a partner. We'll all watch each other's backs, but focusing on one person is easier than focusing on many. You keep your partner safe, and if you have problems, call out for the rest of us. But there are an odd number here, someone said. Won't that leave someone out? I'll check between all the groups and help where I can. Also, if you see Rui, the waning moon, leave him to me. Rui, was that the demon's name? Just, what? And leave him to a kid? You, sure you can take him, Kamado-san. Another one of the group members whose name Imagawa didn't remember asked unsurely. For the first time, the boy's expression turned sharp and Imagawa could see a warrior. Yes, then he brightened right back up. So, does everyone have a partner? He made sure that everyone had someone to watch their backs before he turned and had them begin their trek up the mountain. They walked for more than half an hour, straining to see through the darkness as a light of any kind would be a giant beacon. Fortunately, they had enough moonlight to light the pathway, although it made going into the darkness of the forest all the more ominous. Imagawa found himself tripping over far too many roots as they kept their senses peeled for anything out of the ordinary. Then, finally, a distant scream reached them. Imagawa nearly lost control of his bladder. Fortunately, Kamado-san's voice called out, "That's Jiu-san's group, not ours. He hasn't called for help, so keep going." Another 10 minutes and they came across the balls of thread hanging in the trees. This time, Imagawa yelped, although he saw no demon. Then he remembered Kamado-san talking about people trapped in these things and being digested alive. It took all his willpower to not throw up. We have to try and save them, Miebe said softly, apparently thinking along the same lines. Swallowing hard, Imagawa nodded, agreeing. But before they could do anything, a flash of color ran by them, jumping through the treetops and slicing through the silk holding the balls up, while simultaneously cutting each one of them open. That had definitely been a water style, used by Kamado. Okay, Miebe said, he deserves the Kino rank. Yeah, Imagawa said, his voice a little rough. They weren't the only ones that hurried over to each of the dropped balls of silk, as several others of their group rushed in, hoping they could still find living humans. The most they found were skeletons covered in tattered clothes. He did lose his dinner then. He was almost glad he wasn't the only one. Before they could really finish checking everything, though, a screech of rage drew their attention to the edge of the clearing where Kamado and a white-haired, very pale girl fought. Well, she fought, swiping at him with her claws, while he dodged smoothly. They could really only watch for several seconds, each looking for an opening to help. But the boy made one himself, stepping around one of her thrusts, and calling out, "Sixth form, whirlpool." He twisted his body around and spun in a whirlpool-like pattern, similar to many wind-breathing techniques. It was awe-inspiring to see. The demon's eyes opened wide, gasping as she realized that the blade had sliced through her at least 3 times. One of those times had certainly been her neck. She fell to the ground as her body began to disintegrate. "Arui," she whispered. "You said you'd save me." Kamado sighed and then, to everyone's utter shock, turned and clapped his hands, as if saying a prayer over her body. "Just what?" Next to him, Mieb stiffened and she stomped forward. He really should have expected that. She'd lost her brother to a demon. That was why she'd joined the Corps. She hated demons. "Kamado," she yelled, grabbing him by his collar and slamming him against a tree. He didn't so much as wince, just staring up at the taller woman. "What was that?" she yelled. "Mieb," Imagawa started, holding his hands up placatingly. She ignored him. Kamado blinked. "What was what?" he asked innocently. "That prayer. Over a demon." "Ah," the boy said, his eyes lighting with understanding. "I was just praying that in her next life, she didn't become a demon." His happy smile seemed to throw Mieb off as she spluttered. Those monsters kill people." Kamado nodded, still as calm as ever. "To live, they have to. It's a lot harder to just let yourself die than one might think, and few people actually want to become human-eating monsters." Imagawa had never seen Mieb at a loss for words before. "Demonic cells are like a virus, you know." Kamado went on as if they were having a calm discussion over tea. "Mutant cells attack and convert human cells at a terrifying rate. That's why demons have to eat other humans. Mutant cells need more to infect. They don't like being dormant, and that's why they increasingly drive a demon to be feral the longer they go without food, as a general rule. Demons are infected humans, they're sick both mentally and physically, which is why we have to kill them. But then they just disintegrate. We give even the worst of our criminals a decent burial, but these sick people don't even get that. That's why I pray over every demon I kill. It's what I'd want if the worst ever happened to me." For the first time, he looked away from them, down and to the side, and suddenly seemed so sad and haunted. Was that the right word? Imagawa wasn't sure. All he could do was sit there and stare at the kid in shock. He'd never seen it that way before. He'd initially heard of demons after his family had gone to see his aunt and uncle, only to come across the blood-splashed home crawling with Kakashi, who had had to explain everything. His mother had been devastated and his father hadn't seemed to really know what to say. The idea that a sick person had done that, well, it did make a sort of twisted sense, he supposed. He still found the thought uncomfortable. "Well," Kamado pushed Mieb's hand away and dropped to the ground. "We need to keep going. There might still be people we can save on this mountain." And with that, he began to march off through the trees. Just before he disappeared, he looked back at the group of demon slayers, all staring silently after him. "Are you coming or not?" he asked, that innocent expression of his back in place. Imagawa looked over at Mieb and put a hand on her arm. She just turned to stare at him, as if she'd had her entire world turned on its head. Maybe she had. "Come on," Imagawa said as surely as he could. "Focus now. We can worry about what he said later." She blinked and looked down at the spot where the demon had disappeared. "All right," she said after a moment. Then, more firmly, "Right?" And with that, she stalked after the kid. Slowly, the rest followed. They were attacked by another girl about 10 minutes later. This one, Kamado let everyone else surround. She could, apparently, make large, sticky webs that made it difficult to move. She had several people caught before Kamado distracted her, and Imagawa saw his chance. He shot forward and took off the girl's head with his wind-breathing style. He turned around to see her head and her body hit the ground. But what was worse were the tears in her eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a demon cry, but it was the first time he really took a look at the expression on her face: fear, sadness, resignation. Before he realized what he was doing, he'd clapped his hands together and said a quick prayer for her soul. It took him several seconds to realize what he'd done. He looked over to see Mieb staring at him, somewhere between shocked and betrayed. He was about to apologize when a hand clapped him on the shoulder. He looked down to see Kamado-san looking up at him, eyes so warm and kind. "Thank you," he said softly. For several seconds, Imagawa just sat there looking at the boy, blinking as if to make sure he was really there. But then he felt himself smile sadly. "Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you." The boy grinned that beaming smile at him for a couple of seconds, and Imagawa felt as if he were standing in full sunlight. Then a sound hit Kamado whipping around and his eyes widened. "Take care of each other," he said. "And if you run across Jiu-san or Mitsuri-san, tell them I've found Waning 5. And with that, he took off into the trees, chasing a white-clad figure. Imagawa stared after him for several seconds before he took a deep breath and turned back to the group. Why, you heard him. Come on. Several of the Slayers looked at him as if they weren't sure what to think. To be fair, he wasn't entirely sure what to think. But he looked at Miabe and saw her staring at him thoughtfully. He didn't know what expression he wore, but after a couple of seconds, she nodded at him and walked over. Let's go, partner, she said quietly, albeit tightly. He almost melted in relief. For now, they were all right. So he nodded, and they continued on. Rokurou grinned as he stood behind a clump of trees, eyes searching the clearing where they would spring their trap. He could already taste Lord Muzin's blood, could only imagine the power it would give him. How lucky were they that this had happened, that the boy had actually shown up for this. It had been a bit of a gamble to come here, but it had paid off. His grin widened and he crouched, already in his first release mode. His demon blood art allowed him to power up, so to speak, granting him an immense amount of speed and strength for each release. Currently, he could release up to 4 times, and humans would have a difficult time keeping up with him at 1 or 2. Each release granted him an extra limb as well, a semi-prehensile tail. And while he also gained facial markings similar to a monkey known as a mandrill, that wasn't nearly as important as the speed and stamina burst he got with each release. Too bad he had a harder time thinking with each release too, but that tended not to be a problem above 2 tails unless he was going up against another demon. He couldn't see where Wakiraba had situated himself. He'd disappeared into the foliage far too well, but wherever he was would make for good long-distance support. Rokura could barely make out Kaminu across the clearing, holding fistfuls of his paper shikigami. He'd mainly be in charge of keeping the kid in the clearing while Rokurou and Mukego fought him up close. She just had to lead him straight here. Why was it taking so long? Where was she? Had he captured her? Killed her? No, Mukego may be flighty and lazy, but she was also one of the 12 Kazuki for a reason. And she should know she couldn't take on the kid that killed Enmu without backup. She'd be there, although it would be nice if she could get there before the sun rose. He resisted the urge to begin pacing, and he wasn't the only one. Kaminu seemed to be fidgeting even more than he normally did, and he could hear Wakiraba grinding his teeth somewhere up above. And then he heard something else. Footsteps. Immediately his grin returned and he crouched down, ready to pounce. He wanted to wait until the kid knew, wanted to see the look of horror and realization on his face, wanted him to know he was beaten. And if the others knew what was good for them, they'd wait for Rokura to attack first, just like they'd planned. Mukego ran into the clearing, looking like Rui, then stopped on the other side and turned back into herself. She didn't turn around. The kid raced into the clearing, blade ready to strike, but he must have noticed the change because his eyes widened. Rokurou nodded at Kaminu, who grinned, and a wall of paper shikigami built up in seconds, blocking off where the kid had come from. The wall of reinforced paper, stronger than wood, continued to build up in a circle around them. The demon slayer still swung for Mukego's head, but he was distracted and thrown off. She ducked easily. He threw himself forward, rolling in the air to land on his feet, holding his sword up between him and the she-demon. "Who are you?" he asked warily. Apparently she hadn't opened her eyes yet. Rokurou couldn't see her face, but he knew the smile she was giving him. He'd seen her give it to Prey before. Rokurou could also tell when she opened her eyes because the kid's breath caught in his throat, before he forced himself back into the strange pattern of breathing. The kid glanced behind him, up in the trees, and then off to where Kaminu hid. Then he glanced around the clearing, right at where Rokurou hid. So he'd marked all of them. Impressive. Not that it would help him in the end. Waiting for. He paused. And 3 other waning moons. Mukego clapped her hands. Ooh, interesting. Well spotted. No wonder you beat Enmu. The brat's eyes narrowed a little. What do you want? Weelul. She drew the sound out. Lord Muzin wants to talk to you. It's quite the honor, really. We're here to take you to him. If anything, the kid's expression darkened for several seconds, but then he just up and smiled a bright, innocent smile at her. "No, thanks. Oh, come on," she whined. Rokurou rolled his eyes, but let her continue. If she could persuade him, then it really would be better for all of them. You're going to him either way, so you may as well just come along. It'd be so much easier for all of us. The boy's smile didn't falter as he opened his eyes. "I'd rather die." Mukego blinked, then sighed. "Fine." And with that, she duplicated herself. "I'm so glad you're not a pillar." All 4 of them said at once. Before they could even take a stance, Rokurou saw his opening and he lunged forward, using his speed and strength to aim for the boy's head. A little love tap to knock him out. The kid must have sensed him coming somehow because he ducked and rolled, but got to his feet just in time to meet one of the Mukego clone's claws. She didn't have any real offensive capabilities other than her normal demon speed and strength, hence why she was still a waning moon. The kid kept up with her easily for about 2 seconds before the others reached him and he had to jump back and away. She didn't let up and Rokuryo made a leap for where the kid would land, both pursuing him. The boy, somehow, realized it would be over if he landed and managed to flip in midair, using one of his breathing techniques to make Rokuryo move or risk losing his head. Impressive. But he could tell the kid was having difficulty keeping up with all of the Mukegos. Still, he didn't have a single scratch on him just yet. And at that point, the kid took off one of the Mukego's hands. She screamed and melted away, dropping in a puddle of goo on the forest floor. The kid's eyes widened, and he seemed to get more determined, like he thought he could win. Not happening. Rokuryo sped towards him again. The kid saw out of the corner of his eye, but instead of simply dodging out of the way, he grabbed one of the Mukegos and jumped back, putting her directly in front of Rokuryo, who couldn't stop in time. In seconds, he skidded to a halt, disgust on his face as she was now goo all over the floor and his body. "Oi, stay out of my way," he bellowed, knowing full well it wasn't her fault, but angry at the situation anyway. "Well, if you weren't charging all over the place like a raging rhino," she shot back. Then the kid just appeared behind her, blade ready to swing. He may have succeeded in taking her head if Wakuroba hadn't taken that moment to enter the fray. A blood-red X-shaped shuriken-like weapon hit his sword, knocking it off course. The demon slayer cut off Mukego's horn instead and she screamed. Her other self rushed in, getting her out of harm's way while a series of those X-shaped weapons began to rain down on the brat. He deflected them fairly easily, but Rokuryo jumped forward, this time stopping in front of the kid, fist raised to send him to dreamland. Their target managed to deflect it with his sword, but Rokuryo didn't let up, heading right after him and punching again and again. The kid still deflected or dodged each shot. Rokuryo couldn't help it if he felt a little giddy. He always had enjoyed a good fight. He kept it up, pushing the offensive, and the brat continued to match him. Rokuryo had already released twice, so he decided to up the game and released a third time. The expression on the kid's face made it completely worth it. He knew he was screwed, except he wasn't. Hinakami Kagura, Parhelion Rainbow. His movements changed. Instead of flowing like water, he suddenly flashed like fire. Whereas before, he'd practically danced as he fought, meeting everything Rokuryo could give blow for blow and just moving around what he couldn't. Now he ran at his opponent in full offense. Worse, Rokuryo knew he'd smacked the image of the kid at least twice, but his fist meant nothing both times. And that suddenly, he was on the defensive as the demon slayer thrust and swung, eyes forward and angry, and yet pitying. Was that really pity? Why could he see pity? Without thinking, he gave into his final release and lost all but his most basic thought processes. It would be worth it. Kaminu bit his lip as he watched the fight before him. No wonder the demon slayer had been able to beat Enmu. He could match Waning 2 in his fully released state. That kind of speed was easily waxing moon level. If Rokuryo could actually retain his thought processes, he'd likely be a match for waxing 3. Maybe. And the kid was keeping up. Not just with Waning 2, but with Waning 3's thrown Xyz. This kid had to be Keimanu's age, so how could he be this good? Very suddenly, he was glad Rokuryo had more or less dragged all of them together to fight the kid. Next to him, her laziness recovered from losing 2 of her clones. It shouldn't take her long to recover. Okay, I can see why Lord Muzan wants him, the coward muttered. For once, he agreed with her. If the kid was this good now, they had to take him out before he got even better. So, why did Lord Muzan want him alive? Shouldn't he want the kid dead? Were they good enough to take him alive? He's only human and tiring already, Kaminu muttered, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Of course he is, Mukego said with a scoff. Waning 6 ignored her. Then, much to their horror, the kid got in a shot and took Rokuryo's arms. They grew back fairly quickly, but still, Mukego gasped and Kaminu felt his stomach clench and drop. That had been waxing moon speed. How was he not a pillar? Beside him, Mukego curled in on herself. We should run. If we run, we die. Kaminu shot at her. This is our last chance. Do you think Lord Muzan will accept anything else? If we fight here, if we go all out together, we might stand a chance. As much as he hated to support her of all people, he also wanted to live. In the clearing, Wakuraba began raining down his blood art shuriken as Rokuryo backed off for a moment, staring blankly at his arms as they finished growing back. His loss of his mental faculties at this stage was very much not helping. All out. How? Mukego asked. Don't you have your final form of your blood art? I lose all my healing and regeneration if I choose one form and all of my speed and strength if I choose the other. She hissed. Well, choose one, he said. Then he held up a handful of shikigami. And put these around your neck. It'll provide more protection at least. They both knew it wouldn't add nearly enough from a direct blow, but it might be able to deflect a grazing slice. In the clearing, Rokuryo roared and flung himself back at the demon slayer, who jumped up and over the charge, but it cost him. He grit his teeth as 3 of Wakuraba's Xyz landed home in his legs. "See," Kaminu said, "we can take him. We just need more fighters and maybe a distraction." "A distraction?" she asked, blinking as she realized something. Then she grinned. "I've already made eye contact with him. Why didn't you use that before?" He almost screamed. "Easy for you to say, hiding here, and doing what I'm supposed to." He pointed to the walls of Shikigami that he'd built. It wouldn't truly stop either one of the combatants if they were desperate enough, but it did give a basic area to work with, keeping other demon slayers out more than anything else. "Now are you going to take my protection or not?" He sent a small group of paper dolls towards her and she reluctantly allowed them inside her guard. He'd have to burn them later as they'd touched her, but it would be worth it. "Fine," she said and changed form, then stepped out into the clearing. The kid's eyes widened when he saw her, and in the middle of the fight, he froze. Nezuko. Funny, she still looked like a demon. Was that Mukego losing control of her power or? Rokura, thank Musen, didn't waste time, grabbing the kid by the neck just as several more of Wakuraba's Xyz made their home in his back. He gasped, eyes going wide in pain before clenching shut. The Xyz would melt soon. They were made of waning 3's blood after all. But for now, they were either very lucky those hadn't pierced his heart, or Wakuraba was a better shot than any of them had given him credit for. The kid grit his teeth, only opening one eye, the other still squeezed shut in pain, as he looked over at Mukego. "Nezuko. What? Why? How?" He managed to get out around Rokura choking him. It sounded like more than just physical pain. Was that why he'd become a demon slayer? Because he'd lost this, whoever it was. Had she become a demon? Behind them, Wakuraba came wandering out of his hiding place, holding a red spear in his hand and grinning. "Well, it looks like we got him." The kid struggled and raised his blade. "Oni-chan, don't," Mukego cried out. So the girl was his sister. Just how much of the other person's relationship and memories did Mukego get with her mirror ability? It just wasn't fair that someone as lazy as her got such an amazing blood art. The kid froze, staring at her. "Please, just let them take you." For several seconds, the forest remained quiet and it looked like the kid had given up. He looked down, eyes closed. Kaminu relaxed a bit and edged into the clearing. Then the demon slayer changed. "Don't you," he said, voice practically a growl as he grabbed his sword with both hands. "Use her face." Then he looked up and Kaminu gasped. Those weren't the eyes of a human. Not the bright red, almost pink, and definitely glowing ones that said waxing 0. What? Hinakami Kagura, clear blue sky. His sword swung up and Kaminu could swear he heard the kid's neck break as he swung. He shouldn't be able to even move. No human should even. But he did. A circle of flame appeared and shot out, pushing them all back. And then the kid disappeared. "Mukego, now's a good time to use your final form," Kaminu said, retreating back into the bush, pulling out more Shikigami as he did. Wakuraba raised his spear he'd been leaning on, tensing to fight again, but something cut through it, and took his head with it. Hinakami Kagura, waltz. The kid appeared for just a moment, swung, decapitated waning 3, and then vanished again. Mukego reverted to her normal form and a duplicate appeared beside her, the only one she had left. They locked hands. "Kuro no gape," she yelled. The two of them merged into one. Instead of the half-white, half-black fur around her collar, it was now completely black. So she'd gone for offense. Surprisingly brave of her. Also very necessary in this instance. Her speed doubled and she leaped forward, intending to work with Rokuro just as the kid turned to fight the approaching waning moon too. The blows that followed, he couldn't see. Off to the side, Wakuraba's body was disappearing and all of the remaining Xyz, as well as the spear in his hand, melted away. That meant it was up to Kaminu to provide long-distance support. His walls were built, so he could concentrate on that now. He hoped it would be enough. He sent a fistful of Shikigami out towards the fighters, directing them to follow and attack him when he leaped away. The kid swung, cut through and burned many of them, so Kaminu sent out more. He was running out though, and it would take time to make more. The kid disappeared again, reappearing behind Rokura, who managed to turn in time to have his fist cut right down the center. The kid didn't let it stop, making sure it followed through, although it didn't cut Rokura's neck. But that was close. The waning 2 yelled in pain and fury, backing off to heal as he literally held himself together. In his place, Mukego rushed forward, swinging at the kid's side, but he dodged again. Kaminu redoubled his efforts, directing the Shikigami at the kid's back and neck and whatever else he could get to. The boy winced and then seemed to get angrier. His wounds healed almost immediately, but he wiped his hand along where the Shikigami had cut him, smearing his fingers with the remaining blood, and then flung his arm out wide. Demon blood art, palm fire explosion. Waning 6's eyes shot open wide. Wait, did he just? But he didn't even have time to finish thinking that sentence as a red flame shot from the boy's hand and literally exploded throughout the clearing. He tried to get ahead of it, but it spread so quickly. And then pain. Pain, pain, pain. The world burned and he couldn't think of anything else, couldn't see that the forest around him was, in fact, not burning. Couldn't see the boy land in the center of the clearing while the other two demons screamed. The fire couldn't kill them, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. No sooner had the boy landed than he launched forward and cut off both of their heads with a cry of Hinakami Kagira, raging sun. Their cries stopped and their bodies burned away. Kaminu saw this out of the corner of his eye and knew he had to move. He had to get away. The fire, blessedly, thankfully, stopped, and he tried to get up. All of his shikigami were gone, burned in the fire, so he had nothing to work with, no weapons. No wonder he was still the weakest of the 12 Kazuki. He rolled over and managed to get to his hands and knees, then went to stand as his skin began rebuilding itself. But it was too little, too late. One moment he had reached out to grab a tree trunk, and the next, the kid was there, standing over him, looking down with determined eyes that also somehow seemed sad, even with the kanji written in them. Was this all a farce? Had Lord Musen sent him to kill them all? Was he somehow infiltrating the demon slayers? This made no sense. The last thing he saw were those eyes that should be a deep brown red, but were now glowing bright, and still so kind and infinitely sad. Then his sword slashed down. Imagawa didn't know what to do. The silk threads turning people into puppets were attached by spiders, and there were so many spiders everywhere. Slicing each one with a sword did nothing, but seemed to be the only way to kill them, and they were already fighting their comrades and trying to cut the threads attached to them. They hadn't lost anyone yet, but more than one person had a broken arm or leg, and it was just a matter of time. And where was Kamado-san? And then the fire came, spreading over the mountain, and Imagawa knew he was going to die. He didn't want to die, and yet he hadn't run. He was so proud of himself for not running. Others tried to run, but Imagawa just stood there, letting his sword drop and waiting for the fire. It flew past them and he scrunched his eyes shut, expecting pain. It never came. Gasping, he realized that the fire didn't burn. It felt warm. He'd even describe it as comforting somehow. But this couldn't be anything but a demon art. Just, what? Then he noticed the spiders, burning, withering, and flaking away as if they never was. He blinked in confusion, and from the yelps of surprise from the other demon slayers, he wasn't the only one. More shrieks and screams, and then it was over. The fire vanished as if it never were, burning away anything that had been demonic. Blinking, he looked down the mountain a little ways and saw Miebe standing there, looking about as flabbergasted as he felt. No, seriously. What? For the second time that night, his friend looked to be at a loss of words. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, and then she just looked back to where the fire had come from. The same place Kamado had disappeared to. Kamado-san, he said. Go, Teruano said from where he lay with a broken leg, drawing both of their attention. What? Imagawa asked. We have enough here for now. Go support Kamado. But he's just a kid, Taruano said, his dark hair slick with sweat and sticking to his forehead. Imagawa felt something similar happening with his own short ponytail. They were tired and tense and had been fighting for far too long. But Taruano was right. Hi, he said. Miebe. She nodded at him, and they took off through the trees. They encountered no more demons, and it took them over an hour to find Kamado Tanjiro, collapsed against a tree on the edge of a clearing, sword right by him. Miebe found him first. Imagawa, she called. Everything else flew out of his mind when he saw her kneeling beside Kamado, lightly slapping his cheeks. Much to their relief, he groaned and forced his eyes open. Red-brown irises and round pupils met his and then closed again. Kazuki, he muttered. Both Imagawa and Miebe stiffened. What? Miebe asked. Waning. Moons. Gone. He barely seemed to be able to open his mouth, slurring the sounds out with great difficulty. Waning moons. As in plural. Miebe asked worriedly, looking around. Imagawa did as well, but they found nothing. Everyone, okay? Kamado gasped. Miebe and Imagawa exchanged glances. The last we saw, yes, Miebe finally reassured. Good, Kamado said with a small smile. And then he collapsed. Oh oi, Kamado, Imagawa yelped. Miebe quickly checked him over, but he looked fine. Not a scratch on him, no bruising, no swelling that I can see, no broken bones. She bit her lip. If there are waning moons around here, I think we need to risk moving him. Imagawa nodded and went to grab his arm. I'll carry him, Miebe said. You have more techniques that can defend us. Mine are all power. Besides, she winked at him, I'm bigger. He snorted, feeling a little of his fear and worry melt away. Whatever, you are not bigger and taller. She shrugged and laid Kamado across her shoulder. Imagawa bent down and picked up his black blade. Huh, black? He'd never heard of someone with a black blade before. Was that because of his sun-breathing style that he'd mentioned? You coming? Miebe asked. Yeah, Imagawa said hurriedly and went to run after her when something caught his eye. It was a series of tracks in the mud. He leaned down and looked at them. They were much larger than Kamado-san's. After a moment of studying, he quickly stood and rushed after her. He must have fought someone here, maybe the source of the fire. They were large. Miebe stiffened a little, but otherwise simply kept walking. Guess we better keep an eye out, then. And with an unconscious 14-year-old recovered, they hurried down the mountain as quickly as they could, only really relaxing when they came across the Kakashi helping their teammates. Even though at least 4 people quit the Demon Slayer Corps after that, their group hadn't lost a single person. Kawa, report. The Kasugai crow called out as it landed on Kageya's table, drawing his attention away from the papers in front of him. Ah, yes, you are Kamado-san's crow, Hachiko-san. Welcome. Please tell me what has happened at Mount Natagumo. T-tanjiro has defeated Waning Moons 2, 3, 4 and 6. Alone. Kageya's eyes widened and he stared at the crow with his fading vision, wondering if his hearing had gone too because. Please explain. And the crow did. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And comment down your opinion on this video. Thanks for stopping by and I'll see you in the next one.